to Black Op Radio, the voice of political conspiracy research. You're listening to Black Op Radio, the show NSA doesn't want you to hear. Now here is your host, Leno Sanek.
Control, you're on the air.
Yes, we are on the air. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Black Op Radio. This is Leno Sanek. Today we have what should be a great show. We have a debate of JFK research, the Warren Commission supporters and Warren Commission critics. So let's see if we have them both on the line. Hello, Jim. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
John McADAMS, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Well, I don't think that we need too much introduction. I think everyone in the community is well aware of who you both are. You have opposing views. We're going to get into it tonight. To be fair, we have a timer. We have questions and rebuttal, counterpoint. I hope that's no problem. We also have spelled out, roughly questions that both sides have an idea where the debate is going. So it's, no ambush or anything that we laid out. I put it on the Black Op Radio forum as well. I think other people have where we're going with this. We're going to start off with an introduction to represent each side, and then we'll get into the questions. We'll take a break. It'll be about 9-10 minute break, and then we'll have the other 10 questions and a summation from each, and we'll call that a day for tonight. I guess then, without any further ado, then we'll start off with introduction from John McADAMS and then hear from Jim.
Sure. In considering this particular issue, I think it's important to base one's conclusions on the most reliable evidence. Some evidence is more reliable than other evidence. Hard forensics evidence is more reliable. Firearms evidence, authenticated photographs, authenticated handwriting from various people, particularly Lee Harvey Oswald. If you base your conclusions on the most reliable evidence, you will tend to come to a particular conclusion, which I think is that Oswald did it. If you want to reach another conclusion, you certainly can. There's just a huge amount, first of all, there's a huge amount of noise in historical data generally, but this particular case, the Kennedy assassination, is particularly bad in terms of having a huge amount of noise. That is to say, witnesses who give somewhat wacky testimony, sometimes they appear to be just flat out lying, sometimes they appear to just be mistaken, sometimes the people who question them appear to have misinterpreted their testimony. You get plenty of government documents written by bureaucrats who were clearly clueless and simply didn't know what they were talking about. You get people seeing things in photographs that aren't there. We could talk about all of this stuff. I don't think that's on the list. So there is simply a huge amount of noise. So on any particular issue, what you want to do is ask, what is the hardest evidence? What is the most reliable evidence? And quite frequently, there'll be a killer piece of evidence. That is to say, there'll be a piece of evidence that is extremely hard, extremely reliable, and you can depend on that. Just to take one example that I don't think is on our list of things to discuss, was a Mauser rather than a Mannlicher Carcano discovered on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. What happens, there is, number one, there's a photo of the rifle in place shot by a guy named Studebaker with the Dallas Police. There is also a 16-millimeter film shot by Tom Allier. And what happens when you look at that 16-millimeter film and analyze it? The rifle is, in fact, a Mannlicher Carcano. In fact, there are a bunch of distinctive marks on it showing it's the same Mannlicher Carcano that now sits in the National Archives in College Park. Well, that's one example of how a lot of noise can be swept away simply by latching on to one really reliable, one really solid piece of evidence. And I'm not sure if I'm up to my time yet, but I'll pass it on to Jim.
Okay, fine. And that's good. We don't have to use the amount of time if you say what you've got to say. All right, then. Jim, you have an opening statement?
Yeah.
I have a kind of advantage over Mr. McADAMS since I listened to his long and rather disappointing debate with Tom Rossley. And since I have that advantage, I'll use it because I kind of figured he would open up with this because this was his closing argument in the Rossley debate. And there he made this appeal to the same kind of appeal to authority and what he calls hard evidence, etc. And there in that debate, he actually seemed to stress many of the findings of the House Select Committee when they favored him, of course. When they didn't, he didn't mention them. Yet many people today would say that the work of the House Select Committee has, in many ways, in maybe the majority of ways, been discredited. Even Robert Blakey has admitted this in certain areas. For instance, Blakey's linchpin for the ballistics case against Oswald was a neutron activation analysis of Vincent Gwynn. Well, that, which I'm sure a few years ago Mr. McADAMS would have said was, hard evidence, indisputable evidence. Okay, well, that's been completely devastated by the two peer-reviewed studies in the last 3 years. There's the Randage-Grant study and the Spiegelman-Tobin study. Now, those two teams were made up of a metallurgist and a statistician, neither of which Vincent Gwynn was. All right, there's another example. Pat Speer has demolished the work of Tom Canning on the trajectory analysis of the House Select Committee, showing that Canning cheated in several ways to make that trajectory work, including, if you can believe it, but go ahead to his website, it's all there. He actually shrunk Kennedy's head. Then there is the work of the medical panel, which we know today in many ways is just an outright ludicrous fraud, including the covering up of very valuable corroboratory eyewitness testimony, which strongly indicates that there was a frontal shot to Kennedy's head. That's on the list. We'll get to that later. I'll get very specific about that, and I'll get to Mr. McADAMS' role in that. The HSCA also smudged and hid testimony that indicated that Clay Shaw was in Clinton with Oswald and Ferry. They also ignored evidence impacting the provenance of CE-399, which we're going to touch on that later also. The HSCA and Blakey were just suckers for the CIA in a number of ways, as with the rather humiliating Joanniti situation, which Blakey admits today he was snookered on. They covered up the CIA's attempt to steal the autopsy photos, and they cooperated in an attempt by the CIA to lie about the first reports from Russia on Oswald. Where did they go, and what were they classified as? And I think we're going to get to that later either. So attributing to the HSCA any kind of probative value is very dangerous today. The other thing is he actually called handwriting analysis kind of, I think he said it was hard evidence, and he used the signature of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Hotel de Comercio as an example during the Rossley debate, that as evidence that Oswald was there. Well, what he leaves out is that if that was Oswald, he forgot what his name was. Because on the signature thing, has his last name as Lee, his first name was Harvey, and his middle name was Oswald. That happens all the time, right? Everybody mixes up their three names. But we're supposed to believe that the guy who wrote that, I guess Oswald had a temporary mental blackout and screwed up all three of his names. See, handwriting is one of the easiest things to game since it's easy to duplicate. It's easy to practice someone else's writing, and it's even easier to trace it. Okay, I'll give you another example. In the Bruno Hauptmann case, J. Edgar Hoover used his lifetime buddy, Charles Appel, to say that it was Hauptmann's name on the ransom demands. And so Appel testified in court that it was like millions and millions and millions of one, that it was Hauptmann. But Hoover himself knew that the fingerprints on the demand note did not match Hauptmann.
Okay, Jim?
Yes.
Jim, we're at the 4-minute mark for your opening statement.
Okay, 15 seconds, right? That was what we agreed upon? Okay.
Finish that off then.
Go ahead and take a look at the signature of Clay Shaw compared to the VIP lounge sign-in sheet at the local New Orleans papers and tell me it's not Shaw. Charles Appel said it wasn't. Okay.
Okay, that's an opening statement, and I will try to give you...
Okay.
All right, let's start off with the questions then. The first question we have is, why should anyone believe the single bullet theory? John, do you want to start with that?
Sure. It's far and away the best theory. You might start asking this: was Kennedy hit in the back? He clearly was. The wound is has an abrasion collar. If he was hit in the back, what happened to the bullet? There was no bullet discovered at autopsy, and no bullet visible in the X-rays of Kennedy's body, which are, in effect, the entire torso. If it didn't remain in his body, what happened to it? The answer is it had to exit. And if it exited, where did it go? Conspiracists tend to push, absurdly bogus trajectory analysis that has Connally directly in front of Kennedy and facing straight ahead. That's just flat not true. There are numerous photos of the motorcade that show Connally well inboard of Kennedy. And even during this shooting sequence, iTech Corporation found that you could look at stereo pairs of some of the Zapruder frames, and they estimated Connally was 4 to 8 inches inboard of Kennedy. We don't know for sure where he was. We do know very well that he was very frequently, very often in the motorcade well inboard of Kennedy. Now, there are tons of other issues about the single bullet theory because it's, you can basically quarrel about anything there. It's claimed the bullet couldn't have done all that damage and still remain quote unquote pristine. It's not pristine. It's badly mashed at the end and it's warped a bit like a banana. Martin Fackler, a failure analysis associates, recreated a bullet hit on Connally's wrist, Connally's radius bone, which was hit at about 1,100 feet per second, not at the full muzzle velocity of the Mannlicher Carcano. It had been slowed down and came out with a bullet that was essentially pristine. Latimer also simulated the whole thing and came out with a bullet not much different from Commission Exhibit 399. And I'm guessing Jim is going to go into an ad hominem attack against Latimer or Failure Analysis Associates, or et cetera. He has an ad hominem attack against everybody who creates any evidence that he doesn't like, but we're talking about people who publish in peer-reviewed medical and forensics journals. There are tons of other issues. For example, was the throat wound too small to be an exit wound? It was not too small to be an exit wound. A shored exit wound might be small. And additionally, there have actually been studies done of whether ER personnel can successfully distinguish an entrance wound from an exit wound. And the answer is, again, in the peer-reviewed medical literature,
15 seconds, John.
They're often wrong. Is that the 15-second warning?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Counterpoint from Jim then?
Okay. Well, okay. He calls this an abrasion collar. What he leaves out is the abrasion collar, according to the House Select Committee, was going upward. He tries to discredit the Mauser. What he doesn't say is that 30 years later, they found out that there was a 7.65 shell found somewhere in Dealey Plaza, which the FBI hid for 30 years. Okay. What he says about the bullet wound, well, we're never going to know because of all the funny stuff that went on at Parkland, because everybody knows today, except maybe him and some other friends, that that bullet was not found on Connally's stretcher. So, and there were other bullets found that day, according to O.P. Wright's wife, who was a supervisor of nursing at that hospital. Okay? Now, let's get back to what he says about the front wound. The front wound, according to James Hume's notes of Malcolm Perry's phone call to him, was 3 to 5 millimeters. And that's right in his notes. Now, most objective people would say, okay, let's take the middle range, 4 millimeters. Okay, well, that's too small for the 6.5, bullet already. And also, if you believe that that's an exit wound, why is it so much smaller than the entry hole on JFK's back? There's also the problem of, again, I'm using their evidence. If you follow the autopsy report, the trajectory of that bullet would have had to devastate the cervical vertebrae in JFK's neck. Well, they're not. They didn't do anything to them at all. Okay, then there's the evidence of the probes, okay, that we have from the ARB. There's about 7 witnesses who witnessed the probing, and they all said that the wound in the back was much lower, clearly lower, than the wound in the throat, and that the probe did not penetrate to the other side. Okay, then, of course, there's the thing about the trajectory, the 11 degrees upwards and 27 degrees downward. In the Connally, you got 38 degrees. You got a roller coaster between the two men. And then there's the work of Elmer Moore, who the Warren Commission understood that Perry was going to be a bad witness, so they sent Elmer Moore to Texas to talk him out of his story. And we have that from Elmer Moore himself. Okay? I mean, we have that in the newly declassified files. Finally, one last thing. Frazier at the FBI wrote down that he got the Todd bullet, the Elmer Todd bullet, at 7:30 that night. How could that happen if Elmer Todd did not get CE-399 until 8:50 that night at the White House?
Sure. Let me
any counter?
What
Sure.
we have is sort of the usual collection there of this or that factoid, this or that gripe, or this or that complaint, etc. As for the wound being 3 to 5 millimeters, in fact, the witnesses varied a bit on that, from as little as 3 to 5 millimeters to 6 or 8 millimeters. It's also the case, if you'll check standard forensics text, that a bullet wound through flesh does not have to leave a hole as large as the bullet, because flesh is somewhat elastic. As for whether the wound was too low to be consistent with the neck wound, we have a picture of Kennedy's back, and we'll talk later about the authentication of those pictures. The wound was at the level of C7T1, the seventh cervical vertebra, the first thoracic vertebra. That, in fact, is consistent with an exit through a tracheal ring below the Adam's apple. As for what O.P. Wright's wife told somebody at some point, that is very, very distant hearsay. As for the probe not going into Kennedy's back, what is the theory? And I know this theory was mooted at the autopsy, that the bullet penetrated a quarter of an inch and then fell out. Bullets from high-powered rifles don't do that. It's not, in general, necessarily the case that you can probe a wound. The body is not a big block of styrofoam. You move a body, muscles, tissue, skin moves out of alignment, and then, sure enough, you can't necessarily probe a wound. The fact that it was impossible to probe proves nothing at all. And I'd like to know if Jim really thinks the bullet only penetrated a quarter of an inch or half of an inch or something.
15 seconds.
Fell out. That's not what you'd expect from a bullet that Roswald or any assassin would be shooting at somebody that they really wish to kill.
Okay.
Okay.
Jim, you have a 2-minute...
Malcolm Perry clearly had the best eyeball seat in the house to that throat wound, okay? And he said it was 3 to 5 millimeters. And he said he deliberately made a strong mental note of it because he knew he was about to go ahead and slash his tracheotomy through it. As far as the other thing about the T1, well, Pat Spear has proven, even if you go with the House Select Committee's placement of the back wound, which I'm not sure is exactly right because those are so many problems with those pictures, it would have knocked out the front rib in the front, which it did not. I don't know how you can question O.P. Wright's wife. She was only the head of nursing, and everybody there reported to her. I don't know how that's hearsay, because she was right there, and the people were bringing it, to her. As far as the high school, we don't know. I mean, of course, he thinks he does. We don't know what kind of weapons were used in the Kennedy assassination. As far as I'm concerned, that's something that's probably never going to be known. So to jimmy this up and say that somehow, well, that has to be a high-powered rifle because that's what Oswald was firing, well, that's the kind of circular reasoning that has brought the Warren Commission into so much disrepute today.
Okay, let's get to the next question then, and that is discussing the Warren Commission. The question is, whose portrait of Oswald is correct? Your opinions on the Warren Commission's version or Jim Garrison's opinion? So, Jim, why don't you start with that?
Okay, well, I'm pretty sure today that most people who study this case understand that the Warren Commission portrait of Lee Harvey Oswald is so skewed as to be ridiculous. Never factored in Lee Harvey Oswald's relationship with David Ferrie, which is a known fact today, which is that he was his cap chief, back there in New Orleans. And they never factored in how Oswald's personality at this point now seemed to be, here's a guy who's hanging out with this right-wing cap leader, and then at the same time, he's studying Karl Marx. So at this time, you get this kind of double image of it's eventually going to become the Marxist Marine, which is, to say the least, very, very unusual. And then, of course, a defection to Russia, which just happens to take place at a time period of 2 or 3 years, which triples the amount of defections that took place between 1945 and the end of the 1950s. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. All right, then we have the new testimony by Mrs. Hallett, who Tony Summers interviewed, saying that the one visit to the embassy in Moscow with Snyder is wrong. She saw Oswald there, 3 or 4 times, and Snyder took him into the upstairs, which she never even saw. Then, of course, there's the thing about the delay in the CIA recording the reports from Russia that Oswald had defected. For 31 days, this gets lost inside the CIA. Nobody knows where it was. It turns up in James Angleton's CI-SIG department, where it should have never been. And then, of course, there's no investigation in the CIA about the U-2, the danger of him giving up the U-2 secrets until 1963. Then he comes back, and here's this Marxist who just happens to hang out with the 2 most right-wing factions in the southeast quadrant of the United States, the White Russians in Dallas-Fort Worth area and the anti-Castro Cubans, okay, in New Orleans. Happens all the time, right? Okay? And then, of course, there's the 2 very interesting things about what happened to Otto Otepka when he tried to check out to see if Oswald was a real defector or a fake defector, and the pure hell that happened to that guy. He eventually got thrown out of his office, surveilled at his house, canned, okay, and a safe drilled into, and finally the Saturday night call that Oswald attempted to John Hurt, the military intelligence officer on the East Coast, which the Secret Service did not allow to get through.
15 seconds.
And then the next day, of course, another coincidence, Jack Ruby shoots him.
Okay. John, you have 3 minutes.
Yes, what a massive collection of factoids. Yes, Oswald was in Ferry's CAP unit when he was age 15, way before either of them was in New Orleans. The defection to Russia, there's really no evidence that that was anything other than a genuine defection. The House Select Committee on Assassinations put together something called the Defectors Report. There were several defectors. There was a pattern. They tended to be mentally unstable. They tended to change their mind and want to come back. Oswald fit that pattern very well. As for Hallett, Jim's doing what conspiracists typically do, ignoring reliable testimony that's contemporary from people like Schneider, and Tony Summers comes up with... Tony Summers is a sucker for late-appearing witnesses with interesting stories to tell. He's the guy responsible for the J. Edgar Hoover and address nonsense. So we get late-appearing testimony decades after the fact, and Summers buys it entirely. As for U-2 secrets, Oswald really didn't know any U-2 secrets. He could see the U-2 on radar. His radar bubble might get a call asking for winds at 90 angels, meaning 90,000 feet. But the Soviets, in fact, could see the U-2 on radar. Unfortunately, since the CIA was thinking that they couldn't, and eventually they knocked one down. As for Oswald hanging around with right-wing factions, we know what was happening there. The White Russians were people who took pity on Marina Oswald, who was in a tough situation. Oswald beat her up. They did not care for Oswald at all. They did not like Oswald at all. But, hey, they sort of had to take him to a degree just to get Lee Oswald, and they did not like the left-wing opinions he expressed. As for Oswald and Carlos Bringuer at the Casa Roca, Oswald's own explanation for that, in something called the revolutionary resume that he gave to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, was that he was infiltrating the anti-Castro forces in New Orleans, and that he used the information he got to harass them. That was Oswald's own explanation and Oswald's own handwriting for what he was doing. So the idea that he hung around with right-wingers is really absurd, except that obviously the White Russians, who did not like him and had to sort of take him in order to help Marina. I mean, they did things like Marina had very bad teeth, and they arranged dental work for Marina. They really had a pity on Marina, and they really had contempt for Oswald. Oswald didn't like them because Oswald's lefty politics, by the way, went all the way back to when he was a kid. Back to when, for example, in late 57, early 58, he told Palmer
15
McBride,
seconds.
He told Palmer McBride that Eisenhower ought to be shot because he was exploiting the working people. And he also told a co-worker at a lab where he worked in New Orleans, William Wolfe, similar leftist opinions.
Okay.
Did he say that he met Ferry before? Look, he met Ferry in New Orleans, first at Lakefront, then at Mossant. with the cap. He was introduced to him by Edward Vobel. All right, it was in New Orleans. It was those two places, and Ferry formed his renegade cap at Mossad Airport when he was kicked out of the first one for all those illicit things he was doing with those young with those young kids. And it's right after that he meets Palmer McBride, and he starts having these really weird conversations with him about Das Kapital and Karl Marx, etc. You know, how you go from a military family to an idolater of Karl Marx, I don't know. Maybe Renato Sartogs can explain it to us. Okay. As for the thing about the defector report with HSCA, John Newman ripped that to smithereens in his book, Oswald and the CIA. He said the comparisons were not correct because the other defectors did not have the information about the U-2, which he's wrong about that because Oswald had access to the MPS-16, which Francis Gary Powers strongly suspected, whether he's right or not, we don't know, okay, that's what the Russians used to go ahead and shoot him down. To use Snyder as a witness, you know, well, come on, why don't you use Sergio Arcacha-Smith? I mean, Snyder's obviously going to be a compromised guy because he really had secret CIA ties, and everybody knows that today. As for the White Russians taking George de Mohrenfeld was told by J. Walton Moore, okay, at the CIA office in Dallas to go ahead and befriend this guy coming back from Russia. And that provides him entry into the whole white Russian community,
15
but more
seconds.
importantly, introduces him to Ruth and Michael Pein, which I'm really sorry that's not on the list tonight because it's a crucial part of the conspiracy.
Well, we have room for a question.
Rebuttal?
Yeah, you have 2 minutes now.
Okay, I have 2 minutes. De Mohrenfeld, that story that de Mohrenfeld told about being told to keep up with Lee Harvey Oswald is one that he only told in the 1970s. In the 1970s, when he'd had several suicide attempts, when he was claiming that a, quote, FBI and Jewish mafia was out to get him, and he was telling all kinds of crazy stories. FBI files certainly don't show that the CIA in Dallas or J. Walton Moore was making any effort to keep up with Oswald. And I've forgotten what else. Oh, yeah, CIA knowledge. Oswald simply didn't not, U-2 knowledge. Oswald simply didn't know very much about the U-2. What he was a radar operator who probably knew the height at which the U-2 flew. But that's about it, and the Soviets already knew that. As for the HSCA defector report, I don't know how. I've read Newman's Oswald and the CIA, and I don't know how the hell he claims to have demolished that. The report is pretty straightforward and factual. There were several defectors. There was indeed a standard pattern that they were somewhat mentally unbalanced. They typically changed their mind and decided they wanted to come back to the U.S. That was the template that the Americans' embassy was applying to Oswald that had happened before. People had caused trouble for the American embassy. They were happy to get him back to the U.S. simply because he would be less trouble in the U.S. And as for your attacking Schneider, it's just spook everybody with you. The only witnesses you'll accept are those who say things that you find convenient, like Hallett coming forward decades later. There's a whole paper trail from Schneider, and we know what he thought about Oswald. We know he thought he was essentially a mixed-up kid who had, and I quote, learned a hard lesson the hard way and wanted to come home, and he was rather compassionate.
Okay, we've had both counterpoints, so we'll go to the next question, which is, did Oswald go to Mexico City? And if so, what did he do there? And since we're alternating, John, you picked that up. Did Oswald go to Mexico City?
Oh, yeah, he definitely went to Mexico City. He wanted to get into Cuba. He'd been talking with Marina about getting to Cuba by hijacking an airplane, which that got shot down, no pun intended. And so, he figured out another way. He figured you couldn't get a visa in the U.S. to go to Cuba. So he figured out that, hey, if he went to Mexico City, he could get a visa. It was part of his plan to go to Cuba and aid the Castro revolution. In many ways, it was similar to his plan to go to the Soviet Union and be part of a socialist state. He became very disillusioned about that. In fact, he wrote a whole manuscript about it called The Collective, about how stifling life was in the Soviet Union. But he maintained this romantic attachment to Castro and Castro's revolution. We have all kinds of evidence in that. Again, Jim somehow seems to claim, that handwriting evidence doesn't matter. That's miles from what standard forensics people think. We not only have Oswald's signature on the register of the Hotel Comercio, by the way, like everybody else is with, I think it's first name, last name first, first name last. If you look at the other signatures on there, they're the same way. If you look at his travel documents back to the U.S. At the travel agency, it's the same way. We have his signature and picture on a visa application that he gave to the Cuban embassy. We have multiple witnesses, and I consider witnesses generally less reliable than hard-written evidence, but we have two versions of a letter he wrote to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., complaining about his treatment in the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. One is the typed version he actually sent that has his signature on it. It's in his handwriting. The other is a draft that's also in his handwriting. And in Oswald's address book is the phone number of Sylvia Duran, the woman in the Mexican embassy, the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, who talked to him. So Jim's going to have to try to explain away quite a lot of hard evidence here.
Well, let's start right off. Sylvia Duran says she didn't talk to Oswald. She said that before she was abducted by the DFS and she was tortured. Okay, because the word is that's why the CIA had her arrested, because after the assassination, she described the guy to her friends and that didn't look like this Oswald guy. Now, also there's Askew, who says the guy there wasn't Oswald. But let's go back to the beginning. Okay, the FBI could never find out how Oswald got from New Orleans to Houston. Okay, number one, first step of the journey. Then the manifest of the Flecha Roja bus from Nuevo Laredo to Mexico City was stolen, both the original and the copy, and they stole it from two different cities. The border guard recalled that Oswald entered Mexico by car, all right? So what they did is they used the baggage list as a substitute for the manifest, all right, which, by the way, is exactly what Vincent Bugliosi does, all right? Here's the problem. You were only supposed to be on that baggage list if you had a bag or more than one bag in the lower compartment. Oswald carried one bag, and he carried on board with him, so how did his name get on that baggage list? All right. On the way back, it's just as bad because there's two different reports on how he got back to Texas from Mexico City. There's one official report that says he got back by bus. There's another official report that says he got back by car. The bus records were seized and altered, okay? And after they were secured by the FBI, Oswald's name is spelled wrong on them. So here's a guy who goes to Mexico, someone doesn't know how to spell his own name, and neither does the people who are listening to him, all right? Plus, the bus he was on could not get him into Dallas at the right time that he had to be there because other people saw him there at that time. So what does J. Edgar Hoover do? He just goes ahead and puts him on another bus. All right? Now, once he gets to Mexico City, all right, he was supposed to visit both the Cuban and the Russian consulates at least a total of 5 times. So the CIA had to have at least 10 pictures of Oswald going in or coming out of those 2 consulates. All right? And they had good coverage on both places, and they lied to that to the people in the Lopez report, but the Lopez report found out that he did have good coverage. They've never been able to produce one picture of him either going in or coming out. On that point, I agree with Jim Garrison. If the CIA had a picture of Oswald going in or out of the Russian consulate, it would have been on the inside front cover of the Warren report. All right? Then there's the transcripts of his supposed conversations that he had down there. These are summarized in the Lopez report. All right? And what happens, of course, is if you read the summaries, the guy spoke poor Russian and good Spanish. But the weight of the evidence by the HSCA, which Mr. McADAMS reveres, says the opposite. He spoke very good Russian and very poor Spanish. So who's the guy on these phone calls, and why is the CIA lying about this? All right?
15 seconds.
All right. Finally, the CIA knew that Sylvia Duran was describing the wrong person, so when they forwarded her transcripts to the Warren Commission, they edited out the description.
Okay, John, you have 2-minute counterpoint?
Yeah. Gosh, we now have claims of all this faked evidence. I want the listeners to start making a count of the number of people that, if you believe Jim, had to be involved with faking evidence. What he said about Duran was just absurd. She was telling her relatives that the guy in the embassy was Lee Harvey Oswald, who, of course, was all over the newspapers in Mexico City. She'd actually gone down to the embassy to pull out his visa application and look at it. When she was finally arrested by the Mexican police, she thought a cousin of hers had ratted her out, a cousin who didn't much like her, and apparently it was Wynn Scott who, and of course the CIA obviously knew she had interacted with Oswald, who'd ordered her arrested. The notion that she described somebody other than Oswald is ridiculous. You can see her on the 1993 Frontline documentary, simply saying flat out, yes, it was Lee Harvey Oswald that I saw. As for the photos, it is true that Lopez went down there and found some CIA people who said, oh, yeah, we got photos of the guy, apparently they thought they had. For a while, they thought they had, but the simple fact is they had not. They sent pictures that they thought was the guy, and it wasn't Oswald. The handwriting evidence and reliable witnesses like Duran, and of course the three guys at the Russian embassy, really trump any claims of well, this was fake, that was faked. I mean, the whole thing, the idea that he came back by car, that's a sort of a LaFontaine factoid. I don't doubt that you can find one document that says that, but anybody who's looked at a lot of documents know there are all kinds of crazy assertions in CIA
15
documents.
seconds.
You go with the weight of the evidence, you go with the reliable evidence, and the documents show a Harvey, Lee Oswald having a bus ticket back, and taking the bus back to the United States.
Okay, Jim, you have a 2-minute counterpoint.
If you look in the newly declassified transcripts of the HSCA, Sylvia Duran is arguing with Gary Carnwell about the height of this guy that she saw that they call Oswald. And that's why she calls him Oswald, because they call him Oswald. She insists that he's about as tall as Cornwell, who is about 5'4". Eddie Lopez actually pointed this out to me when I actually went up to meet him at his house in I think it was New York, in Rochester, New York. Also, the thing about the Cuban consulate. The Cuban consulate was penetrated. And that's right in Gayton Fonzie's book. And the House Select Committee found this out. Because you have Askew and Duran both saying that it's the wrong guy. Eddie Lopez found some people there. They said he was the wrong guy. But he also found out that there were CIA agents working inside the Cuban consulate. Okay, now what he says about the photo. If you read the Lopez report, which, God, I hope he didn't, because he sure doesn't sound like he assimilated it very much. All right, they show that Ann Goodpasture knew that the picture she sent up there was of the wrong guy because she knew who the guy was. All right? Now, of course, it's just a coincidence that Ann Goodpasture was David Phillips' right-hand man, and David Phillips lied about signing the October 1st cable, which never got up to CIA headquarters until October 8th, which established a communication with Kostikov, which was supposed to be on the last phone call on Saturday, which Sylvia Duran says could not have happened because he never came back after Friday. All right? Now, David Phillips also is a guy who the HSCA found out was laying all this smoke and camouflage through all these third parties about what Oswald's mission really there was, and that Oswald had actually been there like on September the 19th, which even the Warren Commission and the FBI was smart enough to go ahead and debunk that stuff. The reason I believe that cable did not get there until October the 8th, even though it was supposed to happen October the 1st, is because Ann Goodpasture did not want an on-the-spot investigation of who Oswald was really talking to. And that's what would have happened if the cable would have got up there on time. Because Kostikov, of course, as people think, was a CIA agent in charge of assassinations in the Western Hemisphere.
That's the time. Thanks. Okay, we're going to our next question then, which is number 4. Are you satisfied with the official autopsy? And, Jim, you can start this one.
Well, that's almost like a trick question because you have to ask which autopsy. Because in this case, there's actually 3 of them. There's the one done the night of the assassination, which nobody's ever going to really know for sure what happened that night because, as the ARB found out, almost all the notes disappeared, and Humes went ahead and destroyed the first draft of his report. So that's one. Then we have the official autopsy, which occurred later after, and this report was revised. We have this now, in fact, that it was revised from the moment that Ruby shot Oswald. And it was revised, I think, in Galloway's office. That's in Gerald McKnight's book. So that's the second autopsy. And then we have this very modified version of this autopsy, which took place in 1968 by the Ramsey-Clark panel. And that modification was a direct result, we know this now for sure, of the critical books that were being published at that time. And Russell Fisher, who was in charge, actually mentioned that the Ramsey-Clark panel was formed to go ahead and attack what he called the junk in Tink Thompson's book. In that autopsy, in that version, both the wounds are changed. The head wound goes from low at the EOP, 4 inches upward, to the cowlick area. And then the x-rays are altered, and we know this from the ARBB because James Humes, when he's looking at the x-ray, says, Jeremy Gunn says, why isn't this fragment in your autopsy report? And he says, I don't remember seeing it. Okay, and there's like 6 other witnesses who didn't see it. Then it goes, what about this trail from the EOP to the upper part of the head that you're describing in your autopsy report? And he says, I don't see it now. This is one of the, in any other case, except the Kennedy case, which is politically charged, if you brought this stuff into court, it'd be over in about 2 hours. Because this kind of stuff doesn't happen in the real world. Charles Wilbur, a forensic pathologist, wrote a book decades ago in which he listed all the failures of this autopsy. He came up with about 75 things which should have been done, which were not done, or were not done properly. Even Michael Bauden, who in my opinion is a quack on this case, but Mr. McAdams likes to use him, he's even said in writing that when it comes to bungled autopsies, Kennedy's autopsy is his word, exemplar.
15
in other words,
seconds.
It's the number one example. There's so many things that weren't done, like, for example, the sectioning of the brain to trace the bullet's path through the skull. The back wound was not dissected to see if it exited or where it exited. There was no proper consultation that afternoon between Bethesda and Parkland as to what had actually happened there.
3 minutes,
There were way
Jim.
too many people. What'd you say?
I said that's your 3 minutes.
All right, 15 seconds. There were way too many people in the autopsy room, military guys who ended up controlling the autopsy. And we know that from Pierre Fink's testimony at the Clay Shaw trial.
Okay. John, you have 3 minutes or a bit.
Sure. First, about Fink at the Clay Shaw trial. Fink clearly believed it was rushed, and he said it was rushed because of, quote, unquote, the family. We know, for example, from William Manchester's book, that up on the 17th floor at Bethesda, where Jackie, where Bobby Kennedy, where Robert McNamara, who would call down fairly regularly and say, in effect, when is it going to be over? The autopsy was rushed. It was not done by bona fide forensic pathologists. You see, the irony is that a bum found dead in a gutter in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, would have been autopsied by Earl Rose, a competent forensic pathologist. But the Kennedy family was very powerful, so they could decide, or Jackie could decide, that Jackie was going to be autopsied at Bethesda by really ordinary hospital pathologists. Fink was, in fact, a forensic pathologist, but hadn't had much experience actually cutting people up. He had a desk job. Apparently, Humes didn't figure out that the bullet exited the throat until the morning after, when he talked to Perry and found that there was a defect in the throat, and finally figured it out. The tracheostomy had obscured the defect in the throat, and Humes apparently didn't know that. If you really want to know the nature of the wounds, what you want to do is read the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Volume 7. Jim calls Bauden a quack basically because Bauden disagrees with him. There are, in fact, the 9 top forensic pathologists in the country, or pretty close to the top ones in the country, who participated in that. They used the best evidence they had, which was the autopsy photos, authenticated autopsy photos and x-rays, in addition to interviewing everybody who had participated in the autopsy. The Ramsey-Clark panel with 4 top forensics people in 1968. The Rockefeller Commission did the same thing. You got essentially the virtually identical conclusions from both the Clark panel, the Rockefeller panel, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. which was that John Kennedy was hit by 2 bullets from behind, one that struck him in the cowlick area, 4 inches above the EOP external occipital protuberance, and shattered, with one piece exiting about the coronal suture, and another hitting him in the back, transiting the torso, bruising the tip of the right lung, and exiting his throat. So go with the good evidence and the good analysis. Jim says this is an appeal to authority. If you'll just check his college logic book, Jim will find that when the subject is a technical one and the authorities are bona fide technical experts, yes, you go with the authorities. You don't go with the likes of, Harry Livingstone interpreting what the
15 seconds
had to be. And as for the ARRB, that's 30 years after the fact testimony, and for people like Humes and Boswell, that's people who know that they're considered to have bungled the autopsy and whose testimony was rather defensive. There are all kinds of nonsensical stuff in the ARRB testimony for the simple reason that it's 30 years old.
Okay, Jim, you have 2 minutes.
Michael Bauden didn't know how to orient the mystery photo. So there goes his appeal to authority. Michael Bauden told Ida Docks to falsify her rendition of the back of the skull photo. And we have that in his own writing, his handwriting stuff that he reveres, because Randy Robertson actually found that in the archives. Michael Bauden is a guy who in his book says that the Navy didn't take pictures of the autopsy procedure that night. Some FBI guy came in and said that you don't have clearance here, to people like Stringer and Knudsen. So I'm going to take pictures, and this is how he explains why the pictures, which he calls the best evidence, are so bad, because Bauden knows they're bad. So he makes up this story about the FBI going ahead and taking the pictures. Now, show you just how dishonest Michael Bauden is. Gary Aguilar pointed this out to him in front of 1,200 people at the Duquesne conference, that you're wrong about this. We have the 2 FBI guys, Siebert and O'Neill. Neither of them took any pictures. We know who took the pictures. Why do you keep on saying this story? You know what he did? He went on TV and said the same thing again. So if this is the kind of authority that Mr. McADAMS, respects, he's all privileged to do that, but I'm sorry, I have my options and I can measure it some other way, like morality, and I don't consider him an authority. As per Fink, just read Fink's testimony. He didn't want to answer the question about who stopped him from dissecting the back wound. Alvin Oster had to ask him that question 8 times. Read the transcript. It's in my book, Destiny Be Afraid, my first book, Now, let me ask you this. If Robert Kennedy had told him that, or Berkeley had told him that, he would have answered the question.
15 seconds.
He said it was one of the military guys, and the military guys are the same guys who refused to give him JFK's clothing.
Okay, John, you have a 2-minute rebuttal.
Yeah, Jim hates Bauden, no doubt about it, and no doubt about that Bauden's book, which appeared, I guess, in the 1990s, has some inaccuracies in it. If you want to see what the truth is, look at the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Volume 7, which is not dependent on Bauden's recollection years later, but is at the time and is the consensus of 9 top forensic pathologists who, again, reached the same conclusions as the forensic pathologist of the Rockefeller Commission panel, who reached the same conclusions as the Ramsey Clark panel. And I guess Ramsey Clark now is one of the evil conspirators, or maybe all the forensic pathologists on the Ramsey Clark panel are now evil conspirators. Or we know Jim doesn't like Bauden. Maybe all the other 8 are evil conspirators. Or for heaven's sakes, just look at the autopsy photos and X-rays. They show where the bullet entered. There's a color photo in Grodin's book that shows the entry defect in the cowlick area. There are multiple photos that show the top right-hand side of Kennedy's head blown out. There are at least 2 photos that I have access to of the back wound that constitute a stereo pair. Just look at the photos. You can see what the wounds were like. You don't, in fact, really have to be an expert.
Okay, that brings us to the next question then. Do you believe that the official X-rays and photos are real? And, John, you can start with that.
Sure. If you actually read Am I supposed to?
John?
Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me? I seem to have lost you for a second there.
Okay, am I here now?
Yeah, now you're on, yeah.
Yeah, I think I didn't talk directly into the phone.
Okay.
You want to look at House Select Committee on Assassinations, Volume 6 and 7. I know Jim talks about we're talking about technical excellence. In fact, not much to do with other people outside their purview. For example, okay, the skull X-rays of Kennedy. There's such a thing as sinus prints. That is to say, the nasal sinuses in an individual distinct. It's as distinct as fingerprints. House Select Committee compared the autopsy X-rays with ante-mortem X-rays of John Kennedy. It's the same guy. The dentition. There's such a thing. There are people called forensic odontologists who specialize at looking at people's teeth, etc. And again, they got pre-death X-rays of John Kennedy, and the teeth on the autopsy X-rays are the same teeth. And again, there's distinctive as fingerprints of John Kennedy pre-mortem. Several of the autopsy photos exist in stereo pairs. It's virtually impossible, actually impossible, to fake a stereo pair. You would have to have two photos that were slightly different, but different in perfectly corresponding ways. The only way you could really do it is if there was such a thing as genuinely photo out in stereo, but that didn't exist in 1963 or in the 1970s. It doesn't even exist in top-of-the-line video games today. Forensic anthropologists looked at the features of Kennedy's face, etc., and determined that the John Kennedy, that the person laying there on the autopsy table was, in all key characteristics, more metric and morphological characteristics identical to John Kennedy as judged from photos when he was alive. It's really very, very thorough science. It's not Harry Livingstone looking at photos and saying, "Oh, I see evidence of fakery," or Jack White, who, heaven help us, thinks that because you can't see stars in the photos of the astronauts on the moon that they were faked. No, it's serious scientific stuff. Oh, let me mention one thing about Humes telling the ARRB, well, I don't remember that. That's not the same thing as saying the photos were fake. Humes looked at the photos not only in the 1960s. Actually Humes, Boswell, Fink, and Stringer looked at the photos in the 1960s and signed off on a statement saying, yeah, they were authentic. Those are what he saw.
15 seconds.
The photos and X-rays were shown to various people. I know Fink, Boswell, and Humes. I'm not sure about Stringer, but probably Stringer, by the House Select Committee in the 70s, and they didn't utter a peep about their being faked in any way.
Okay. We went a bit over because you did cut out a couple of times there, John.
Okay.
But Jim, you have 3 minutes.
I don't know what he's talking about when he says you can question Hume's testimony. We're not questioning what he said to the ARB. We're questioning what was in his report that he wrote just a couple of days later. They were not, the 6.5, it was not in his report. The thing about the trail going from the EOP to the top of the head was not in his contemporaneous report. So to blame this on the vagaries of memory is ludicrous. The stuff he just said about the 1960s photographic collection certified, by those guys. Well, later on, Hume said that there was a photograph missing. Later on, Stringer said there was said the same thing. And then Jeremy Gunn asked him that direct question. He goes, well, wait a minute. If you knew that there was a missing photograph, why did you sign off on this? And in the conversation that followed, Gunn said, most people would be true in such an important situation. And Stringer said, well, those people don't last too long. So this is what happens in these kinds of situations. Anytime you have a hierarchical bureaucracy, okay, the other people step in line. It's very, very difficult to be a whistleblower, especially in those days. All right? So when he talks about this massive conspiracy, which had 30 million people involved, no. It's the concealment of facts after the assassination, which a bureaucracy has a natural tendency to fall into. And everybody has been caught in that kind of a situation. I have myself because I work in a bureaucracy. All right? Now, as for this sinus thing, what does, as David Mantik has demonstrated, filling in the back of an X-ray have to do with your sinuses? Okay? You know, I fail to see the logic of that. As Robert Groden has said, what does filling in a match shot in the back of the head have to do, you know, with your sinuses? To me, that's just a red herring. All right? You know, I have a very hard time believing the back of the head photograph, and so did many of the witnesses who saw it. All right? I mean, you're supposed to see this huge, gaping, avulsive back of the head, you know, wound. All right? You look at this picture, and not only is it completely sealed, but it actually looks like somebody had shampooed and combed Kennedy's hair and gave it a little trim. You know? I mean, it looks perfect. It looks seamless. All right? I mean, it's very difficult for me to believe that picture. I mean, you could say that the scalp was pulled down to conceal that photograph. I mean, to conceal that hole. But there's two problems with that. I mean, take a look at it. It's a perfect match all the way around. It's hard to believe that the detached scalp could fit it so perfectly. Secondly, where is the picture? There's supposed to be a picture of that wound. Okay? Now, we're supposed to have a picture, but Michael Baden doesn't know how to orient it because it gets him in trouble when he orients it right.
15 seconds.
All right, because it indicates, you know, an exit where he wants an entrance to be. So no, I don't. I have a hard time buying both the X-rays and the pictures.
John, you have
Do
a
I
2
have
minute.
time now?
Yeah, you have 2 minutes now.
Yeah, there are all kinds of reports of photographs missing here and there. They're mostly inconsistent. By a funny coincidence, they tend to be, come up when someone's being questioned on a photograph that probably shouldn't have been taken, but somehow it's not in the set. If there are any missing photographs, they have to be consistent with the authenticated photographs that we have now. The authenticated photographs we have now show quite clearly where the wound was, so any missing photographs have to be consistent with that. As for Mantik, I saw his presentation of the back of the head somehow blanked out. I don't know where he got that, because if you just look at, for example, the House Select Committee volumes, you can see the skull photo with the back of the head visible in the X-ray. I don't know, maybe it wasn't fixed properly, and when he looked at it at the archive circuit in early 1990s, something else was gone. But if you just look at the House Select Committee, there's his blotch on the back of the head, obscuring the back of the head, just flat isn't there. Now, as for witnesses in the back of the head photo, people like Terry Livingstone had a little game they played for a long time. I mean, he may still be playing it. He would take the back of the head photo, which shows a hand holding up a flap of scalp, apparently in order to show the entry defect, because the entry defect is clearly visible on that, but the huge defect in the brain's coming out are not visible. And then he would show them the so-called McClellan drawing. McClellan didn't actually draw it. Tink Thompson, in effect, had somebody draw it and show it to McClellan, and McClellan said, yeah, it was sort of like that. And people would say, no, it was more like that, because the McClellan drawing does have a large defect, and the back of the head photo doesn't.
15 seconds.
The best exercise is to show people the whole set, as Nova did with 4 Dallas doctors in 1968. And if you show people the whole set makes perfect sense.
Okay, Jim, you have 2 minute counterpoint.
It's almost funny what he says about the authentication of the photographs, because if you read the House Select Committee report, when it gets to the part, I think it's in Book 7, about the authentication of the photographs, they specifically say that if this case would actually go to court, you would have a very serious and hard time of getting those photographs admitted as evidence. And they enumerated various reasons. They are not properly marked or identified. They don't even have Kennedy's name on them. And they don't even have the autopsy case number, and they don't even have the date or the place of the examination. They concluded at the end of that section of the report, which somehow Mr. McADAMS missed, that if this case would have ever gone to court, the burden would be on the prosecution to get those things into court. And then if the burden's on the prosecution, the case would completely blow up, because the other rule of evidence, McCormick's rule of evidence, is that you have to have a witness authenticate the pictures. Well, in this case, you have so many witnesses disagreeing with both the provenance of the pictures and what they depict, that it would literally be a rout. Okay, you even have people like Custer and Reeby who were there that night. Okay, you even have people like Stringer, and Knudsen disagreeing what is in, and those are the people responsible for them. Okay, I mean, it's just ridiculous in the real world. Okay, but we're talking about, and there's even disagreements as to about the film paper, because you had a couple of witnesses during the ARB saying that that's not the film paper. Sandra Spencer was one of them that we issued that night. Let me conclude with this. When Pierre Fink went to the House Select Committee on Assassinations and he was shown these pictures, this is what he said. Are you sure these are the pictures of President Kennedy? Okay, now imagine him making that statement in court, okay? I hate to say this, but case closed. That's it.
Okay, we'll go to the next question then, and it is, please appraise the work of the Dallas police in light of what we know today. And Jim, your turn.
I guess the first word that comes to mind is debacle. There's just too much evidence of tampering with the exhibits and the testimony. I went over a lot of this material in Part 6, of my review of Vincent Bugliosi's Reclaiming History. But let's start with the alleged bag of Wesley Frazier. How did it get oil on it if the FBI said there was no oil on the rifle? And where is the evidence that Oswald ever had any gun oil? Okay, why was that bag not photographed in place as it should have been, in situ? And why apparently wasn't it photographed until the 26th when they got it back from the FBI? All right, why does a bag photographed in the hands of the police outside the TSBD, why does that not appear to be the same bag in evidence today? And you can go to Pat Spear's website. He has a great photo comparison of that. Why did Jesse Curry refer to that bag twice in his book as being probably the bag found inside the Texas School Book Depository? Why did there end up being 3 bags in evidence? And if you include the bag that was sent to Oswald on, I think, November the 20th, that we didn't find out about until days later, that's actually 4 bags. And why did Hoover prepare 2 different memorandums as to the origin of those bags before he actually even tested the paper? Okay, what about the shells? The DPD says that there were 3 found that day, but only 2 were sent that night to the FBI. And today the excuse, as rendered in Vincent Bugliosi's book, is that Will Fritz, alias Barney Fife, pocketed one of them for testing purposes, which makes no sense since the tests were being done in Washington that night, and that was standard operating procedure. The FBI lab tested his shells. And the one he appears to have pocketed is CE-543, which has been proven many times over. That could not have been fired that day. And Mike Griffith has proven this. Michael Kurtz has proven this. Tink Thompson has proven this. Forrest Chapman, a forensic pathologist, and ballistics expert Howard Donahue have all chimed in on that. That's some hard evidence he likes to ignore. Then there's Bobby Brown and the famous backyard photographs, which he had to invent a story for him tinkering with those photographs. The DPD seems to have made copies of the photographs after they got them in hand, and that might be the copy that Roscoe White's widow surfaced many years later. And then, of course, there's the murder of Oswald by Jack Ruby, in which the Warren Commission basically fell on its knees before Henry Wade when Burt Griffin wanted to challenge Patrick Dean's ridiculous story
15
about how Ruby got in there. So
15.
In my opinion, the Dallas Police Department is indefensible. I mean, it's a real sad commentary of what you have to deal with in this case today.
Okay, John?
Sure. I'm just sitting here doing a count of the number of evil conspirators in Jim's theory, and of course it includes all the autopsists. It includes everybody who works the House Select Committee and every other panel, and now it includes the Dallas Police. For example, he talks about the paper bag. It says it had oil on it. It didn't have oil on it. Or inside it. That's supposed to be proof that Oswald didn't carry the rifle in, but it's not proof. A conspiracist will quote a memo that says the rifle was well oiled, except that well oiled is not dripping oil. It's a thin coat of oil on the inside. He doesn't mention that Oswald's palm print and a fingerprint were found on that bag. As for the bag and evidence being different from the bag brought out from the depository, I'm afraid that's just crackpot photo analysis along the lines of that that Jack White would probably do. The bags did look different, by the way, because the FBI put silver nitride all over the bag to try to raise fingerprints, and did raise fingerprints. But there's no evidence it's a different bag. As for the bag supposedly sent to Oswald, that was a bag that arrived at the post office addressed to Lee Harvey Oswald at an address where Oswald didn't live. The address had some resemblance to an address where Oswald had previously lived, but it was basically a bag mailed to nowhere. It was probably somebody's idea of a joke that arrived after the assassination, and some harried postal worker said, some joker, and he put it in the, put it in a wherever they put mail that's not going anywhere. So, I mean, that's just absurd that somebody would make a bag for Oswald, mail it to an address that couldn't possibly get to him. As for the notion that spent cartridge, that hull that was dented, quote unquote, could not have been fired, he really ought to read the House Select Committee on Assassination's firearms panel, which basically says that the Manic Arcano quite frequently dents cartridges that are ejected after they fired. In fact, I'm sitting here looking at, I happen to have fired 3 bullets from a Manic Arcano, and I'm sitting here looking at a spent cartridge that has a dented lip. So by a coincidence, but not an improbable one, I got one dented lip on a cartridge when I fired a Manic Arcano. As for the Bobby Brown backyard photo, the Dallas cops were clearly out there seeing if they could recreate the backyard photos. I don't know why that's supposed to be sinister that they were doing that. Clearly they weren't faking the backyard photos that are in evidence because, for example, the foliage in the backyard photos of Bobby Brown out there has grown several inches compared to the foliage in the backyard photos.
15 seconds.
Real backyard photos of Lee Harvey Oswald. So these wild claims of evidence tampering are fundamentally pretty silly.
Okay, Jim. Jim, you have 2 minutes.
Let me just go ahead and read what I wrote about this bag, since I think it goes to the heart of these accusations that he's saying. What really happened is that there was a bag sent to the Pein household on either the November the 20th or November the 21st. It was returned because there was not enough postage on it. But the original address was the Pein household. That address he's talking about did not exist anywhere in Dallas at the time, but it ended up in Irving. And the postage due on the bag was the exact amount due in the notice sent to the Pein household. So I'm sure that's all just a complete coincidence. As for the dented shell, when Howard Donahue found out about this BS story about the dented shell, he said, look, I've been doing this all my life, and I've done a lot of the experiments with the Manic Arcano. I have never dented, and the HSCA never dented a cartridge shell in that manner. Chris Mills did an experiment. He could not dent a shell that way with the full bullet. He could only do it with an empty cartridge in the breech. And then he could only do it once out of 60 times. Okay, so I guess you had the magic bullet. I guess Mr. McADAMS has the magic rifle. Okay, because he can dent this thing anytime he wants to, any way he wants to.
15 seconds.
All right? Chris Mills obviously doesn't have that kind of magical ability.
Okay, and John, you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
I have all 2 minutes. Okay, well, the House Select Committee firearms expert said that it is quite common to dent the bullet when it is ejected. As for Howard Donahue, he's obviously, for example, a capable shooter. He was in the CBS test, but I don't think he spent much time firing a Manic Arcano. As for that bag, I'm sort of puzzled about what bag Jim's talking about. I was talking about a bag that is in a lot of conspiracy books. Tony Summers talks about it, and frankly, I've heard nothing of this other bag. Tony Summers talks about a bag that ended up in a sort of a dead letter bin that contained, it was addressed to Lee Oswald at a non-existent address. But I mean, the question is, why in the world would conspirators mail a bag to Lee Oswald, a bag that was made out of paper and tape from the depository, and send it to the wrong address? Number one, if it was sent to Lee, that meant what? Lee was going to bring the rifle in the bag? Are you admitting that maybe Lee brought the rifle in? And if he did, why not have him make the bag, or somebody else is going to make the bag? Why not just, give it to Lee, catch him outside the depository? Why send it in such an absurdly unreliable way if this is a key part of the conspiracy? I mean, you get these crazy, crazy theories that don't make any sense. You can't imagine that any conspiracy would actually do it that way. It's just kind of wacky. Let me say something about the Dallas Cops. In fact, I think they performed pretty well given the total situation. Obviously, their huge, huge failure was letting Oswald get shot, and I think they were victims of the fact that, number one, they'd never faced a situation like this before. Number two,
15 seconds.
They were very, very concerned with public relations. They knew a lot of the press had anti-Texas, anti-Southern biases, so they wanted to let the press see a lot, see everything, see Oswald, see that he hadn't been beaten or mistreated, and essentially that did them in.
Okay.
Did Oswald in, too.
All right, we'll go to the next question, which is who controlled the Warren Commission, and that's to you, John. You have 3 minutes.
Sure. Earl Warren, but for the most part, the staff. Most of the work on commissions like this is done by the staff. I don't know. I'm sure Jim is going to add everybody associated with the Warren Commission to his long list of evil conspirators, the House Select Committee, now the Ramsey Clark panel, the Dallas police. So why don't I just turn it over to him and let him do it?
Okay. All right, Jim?
Did he just forfeit his 3 minutes?
Well, yes, he offered it to you, I guess, in rebut.
Okay, all right. Well, I think it's become pretty clear who controls because of the ARB interviews, the Gerald McKnight's book, Breach of Trust. The commission was forced upon Lyndon Johnson by 3 members of the Eastern establishment: Joseph Alsop, Eugene Rostow, and a third guy who we don't know his name, but he was in the room with Rostow when Rostow called the White House and insisted that a blue ribbon committee be set up, and this was Joe Alsop basically talked Johnson into setting this thing up. Okay, it was basically their creation. LBJ did not want to do it. All right, and if you read that dialogue, which is in me and Lisa's book, The Assassinations, it's all in there. It's a stunning transcript. Okay, when you read it. Now, once it's constructed, I believe it's dominated by Alan Dulles, John McCloy, and Gerald Ford. And if you read the transcripts, that basically comes through. Earl Warren, I think, was a presiding officer in name only. I think he was neutered due to 3 things. When Ford, Dulles, and McCloy plotted to dump his choice for chief counsel. Secondly, when the commission decided against independent investigators, which they knew the FBI would never swallow. And third, when Elmer Moore was planted on Earl Warren as, I'm saying this in jest, his bodyguard. Moore was one of the original people who were covering up the case from the very day of the assassination. He's flown back to Washington, and he talks Malcolm Perry out of his story. Okay, so I think Warren was basically just a figurehead. Then it was basically funneled false and incomplete information by J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and Richard Helms and James Angleton at the CIA. And Hoover, of course, despised the Kennedys, especially Bobby Kennedy. All right, and he ran a cover-up, which even members of the Warren Commission, admitted to later on. Okay, and we know through the work of John Newman that Angleton controlled most of the files, and he and I think it was William Sullivan rehearsed a story as to who Oswald really was, and that they would never admit that he really had any connections to the intelligence agency. Okay, which putting Angleton in charge of the Warren Commission and Oswald was like the fox running the hen house. Okay, and there's various people like Richard Russell, John Sherman Cooper, and most of all, Hale Boggs, and to a lesser extent, John McCloy later on, who essentially said that, the conclusions of the Warren Report are very, very, very questionable. When you have a majority of the commission saying that their conclusions were very, very questionable, I think it's time to throw in the towel.
15 seconds.
I'm done.
First of all, you have to understand that the commission members who were most likely to decide that, they didn't believe this or that the commission said, they were the ones that attended the fewest meetings. And in some cases, they're obviously clueless. Like you get Richard Russell talking to Lyndon Johnson and telling Lyndon Johnson flat out, I don't believe the single bullet theory. That was because Russell heard John Connally testify and thought John Connally's testimony contradicted the single bullet theory. And then he said, and then John said, well, I don't either. He said, and of course, Johnson at that point had no way of knowing whether the single bullet made any sense at all. He hadn't been at the meetings. And he said, but it doesn't make a bit of difference. And Russell agreed, it doesn't make a bit of difference. Then you get Weisberg latching on to Russell, as he's latched on to so many people, and manipulating him with stories about how, Oswald getting into Russia was suspicious, and Oswald didn't have enough money to go to Russia, et cetera, and basically feeding him conspiracy stuff. And so you get a guy who was not, didn't attend very many of the meetings. Sylvia Maher has a list of who attended the testimony sessions, and who did a lot, who did a little actual count, and he attended it very little. Commissioners aren't infallible. Some of them didn't pay that much attention. The report is essentially done by the staff, and yes, indeed, you can indeed manipulate them. By the way, Russell did tell Johnson, I think you got a pretty good report. And what about Oswald? Well, he was just a general misanthropic fellow. By the way, even when Russell started expressing doubts about some of the conclusions of the Warren Commission, he continued to believe that Oswald did it. As for it being forced on Lyndon Johnson,
15
it's
seconds.
ridiculous to say that Lyndon Johnson, a shrewd politician and president of the United States, can have something forced on him, except by the logic. Somebody needed to investigate it. These folks remembered McCarthy and weren't particularly keen on Congress investigating it. So the idea of a blue ribbon panel of highly reputable and respected individuals, and the fact that they're not respected now by conspiracists doesn't mean that they were not highly respected at the time. It makes perfect sense. It made perfect sense to Johnson, and that's perfectly reasonable.
Okay, Jim, you have 2 minutes to...
Richard Russell didn't attend very many meetings because he decided very early that it was all a setup job. And so what he did is he commissioned his own study of the crime. And they came to the conclusion that it was a conspiracy, and Oswald was not the guy that the Warren Commission made him out to be. I mean, now there's a guy for you. Talk about a lot of guts and a lot of initiative and a lot of good instincts, okay? Now, he tries to concentrate on Richard Russell. Well, how about this? Hoover lied his eyes out to the Warren Commission on Oswald, on Ruby, on their friends, on the bullets, on the gun, you name it. That's Hill Boggs. How about this? From the horse's mouth. When somebody asked Hoover, I think it was 8 months into the investigation, if Oswald really shot Kennedy, Hoover said, if I told you what I really know, it would be very dangerous to this country. Our whole political system could be disrupted. Now, if Oswald was a single assassin with no conspirators and he was just a nut, like the Warren Commission said he did, why would Hoover say that? It doesn't make any sense. Even Bobby Kennedy understood almost immediately that it was a conspiracy because he relayed that message through William Walton that there was a right-wing coup that had just happened and that the Russians should not overreact to this. Okay, so in my opinion, the Warren Commission was essentially a setup. Even the assistant counsel that he names, people like Burt Griffin, he said, we knew the Dallas police would lie to us about anything that would get them in trouble. And Burt Griffin actually tried to investigate how Ruby got into that basement because he didn't think he got in through the Main Street ramp. But Henry Wade insisted that no further investigation of Patrick Dean take place.
15
even
seconds.
Though Burt Griffin specified in his report that Patrick Dean be made a target of further inquiry. Now, I don't know how you run an investigation when you can't even let your own assistant counsel pursue the angles of investigation that they want to. So, in my opinion, the Warren Commission was essentially a setup job from the beginning. And that's why they came to the conclusions that they did.
Okay,
Bob Tannenbaum, chief of homicide, said that the stuff that was exculpatory to Oswald that was left out of the commission, he called it, and I quote, an abomination.
Okay, that's your time, Jim.
Okay.
Okay. The next question, though, is number 8, who shot J.D. Tippit and why? And you start with that. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, well, listening to the Rossley debate, I thought it was very interesting the way that Mr. McADAMS brought forth the evidence, because what he didn't do is he didn't put it in time sequence order. Because if you put it in time sequence order, it has a completely different impact than if you don't. And it's pretty clear it wasn't Oswald. First of all, the first weapon reported on the scene was an automatic, not a revolver, which is what the DPD said that they took off of Oswald. And this just wasn't any eyewitness or ear witness testimony. In the message, it says from the markings on the shells that it was an automatic, not a revolver. Now, if you take a look at the difference between automatic shells and revolver shells, which are in Grodin's book, no policeman could make a mistake on that. None. It's just literally impossible. Secondly, the bullets do not match each other. There were 3 Winchester Westerns that were copper-coated, and there was 1 Remington lead bullet. Bullets are not sold in mixed lots. It just doesn't happen that way. All right, the Tippit autopsy was not made public for 3 weeks. So the Dallas Police Department felt safe in only sending 1 bullet to the FBI immediately. The FBI says this does not match the revolver. That puzzled the commission, so they asked the FBI if there was another bullet. The FBI discovered, I think 3 months later, that the Dallas police had 3 other bullets in the files run by Will Fritz, Mr. Barney Fife. The FBI now concluded that none of the bullets could match the revolver, and the excuse was that the chamber had been altered. So the fallback position now becomes the cartridges. But it's funny about these cartridge cases because they were not listed on the original police report the cops made out the day of the murder. They were added to the inventory 6 days after the first bullet was sent to Washington. All right? They were sent to Washington after they were added. So what happens is that finally, of course, those match because as many rational people would suspect, when the bullet didn't match, since they still had the revolver, they fired off some cartridges and got them to match. Okay? So since the DPD was really in trouble now, so what happens is that the bullets don't match each other. They don't match the cartridges because the shells were 2 Westerns and 2 Remingtons.
15 seconds.
But the bullets were 3 Westerns and 1 Remington. Now, the out is not the cartridges because Poe marked the cartridges, and those initials are not on the cartridges today. I'm done.
Yeah, oh gosh.
John, you have 3 minutes, John.
There is ridiculous. Nobody said over the Dallas Police radio that they were automatic because of markings on the shells. They just said they were automatic. Several witnesses report the shooter, whom virtually all of them identified as Oswald, was fiddling with the gun, like ejecting spent shells. You can do this with a revolver, but there is no need in the world to do it with an automatic. As for the bullets, no, they would. Well, first of all, what about the mismatch of the bullets? Well, that would make perfect sense if Oswald had some Winchester Western and some Remington Peters rounds, and 1 cartridge is missing and 1 bullet was missing. There's a somewhat interesting account from the ambulance attendant who took Tippit out at Methodist Hospital that maybe he kicked the bullet out but was just too busy to retrieve it. But it's easy to believe that 1 bullet and 1 cartridge is missing. Interestingly, when Oswald was arrested at the Texas Theater, he had in the revolver and in his pocket some Winchester Western rounds and some Remington Peters rounds. Now, as for the chain of possession on the cartridges, all the conspiracists like to talk about Poe because he said he thought he marked them and couldn't find them couldn't find his marking before the Warren Commission. We don't know why that was. He could have been wrong, or the markings could have been obscured by other markings. But the other 2 cartridges were indeed marked, so we have 2 solid cartridges that match Oswald's revolver to the exclusion of all other weapons with a solid chain of evidence. Not to speak of the witnesses, and some witnesses are better than others. The really good witnesses are the witnesses who were taken to the lineup before they'd had a chance to see Oswald, the suspect, on television. That was Markham. That was One of the Davis women, I forget which, I think it was Calloway and Ginyard. But there were 3 or 4 witnesses whose identification was pretty solid. It was from a lineup, and it was before they'd had a chance to see the suspect on television. But the best evidence here, as elsewhere, is quite simply the spent cartridges that were matched to Oswald's revolver to the exclusion of all other weapons, not merely by the FBI at the time of the assassination, but they were also examined by the firearms experts for the House Select Committee on Assassination. That's really the...
15 seconds, John.
Okay, I'm done.
Sorry, John, you've broken up?
No, I'm here. I'm here.
I hear you now. Yeah, okay, fine. Jim, you have 2 minutes.
Well, when he talks about a solid chain of evidence, that's just ridiculous. I mean, you don't send one bullet in and then keep the other bullets in the file cabinets, and the Warren Commission has to send the FBI down to get them. That's just a ridiculous statement. I can't believe he said it, because obviously the implication is you were fiddling around with the evidence for all those months, so you would have sent it in the first day. Solid chain of evidence. The cartridges are not listed on the first day inventory. Okay, that's a solid chain. Talking about Calloway as a witness, Calloway is the guy who saw the same lineup as William Whaley saw. And we know what Whaley said. He said anybody could have picked out Oswald because he was complaining, he was loud, he was boisterous, that you had no right, to put me, in this lineup with these other guys. And it's not just Poe, it's also Barnes, the guy who Poe gave the cartridges to, did not recognize him when he was shown them. All right? Now, to even bring up Helen Markham, I mean, come on. I mean, this is a woman who talked to Tippit after he was dead. Okay, this is a woman, by the way, who puts the Tippit murder at about 106. Okay, 106, which is way before anybody else does, and that's something I didn't even talk about yet. Okay, the timing of the Tippit murder, which is another thing that rules out Oswald, because it's about a 9/10 of a mile, from his rooming house to the scene of the Tippit murder. The rooming lady saw him at 104 catching a bus, the wrong way, by the way, that he was supposed to be going to get to the Tippit murder. So if you believe Markham, he got there in 2 minutes, which is preposterous. Bowley's probably the best witness, not interviewed by the Warren Commission, by the way. He put the murder at about 1:10 because he actually looked at his watch. Larry Harris put it, the best expert on that case I've ever known, put it at about 1:09. So we have to believe that Oswald in 5 minutes covered 9/10 of a mile. I ran track in high school. I couldn't do that in my track clothes.
Okay, John, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, the witness is very on time. I mean, for example, among the Davis women, one of them said the shooting was about 1 o'clock. The other said about 1:30. We know when the call came in from from Tippett's police radio, which was about 1:15. Look, essentially anybody who digs around in the data can find something that conflicts with this or that scenario. As for Helen Markham talking to Tippett after he's dead, that's just not true. What she said was Tippett tried to talk, and there probably were some spasmodic movements of some kind. Another witness who came on the scene shortly thereafter basically saw some movements on Tippett's part too, so she didn't say she talked to him. She said Tippett tried to talk, which is consistent with the spasmodic movements. But again, as a case of Barnes not quote unquote recognizing, this whole business of recognizing one spent cartridge as opposed to another is bogus. To have the chain of evidence intact, you don't have to mark cartridges. What you have to have is somebody who says, "I got these cartridges and then I gave them to Officer X." Then you put Officer X on the stand and say, well, I got these cartridges from Poe, and then I handed them over to Officer Y. And marking evidence is not necessary to maintain the chain of evidence. As for evidence sitting in a drawer somewhere, the obvious conclusion of that is the Dallas cops somehow thought they could send one bullet off to the FBI, and that was adequate. I don't know. I think Jim's just saying that the cartridges were all faked. Days after the assassination, there are multiple witnesses. There must be a dozen witnesses, including the Davis women who fished cartridges out. I think Benavides fished
15
one
seconds.
Cartridge out. There are just tons of witnesses that say, yeah, we found cartridges on that day. So I'm not sure what Jim's point is, unless he's adding the Dallas cops to the massive list he has of people who faked or forged evidence.
Okay, well, we're going to the next question then. which is, could Oswald have done what he is accused of doing in the school book depository on the 22nd? And that's for John, then you continue. You have 3 minutes.
I don't know. I mean, are you talking about his so-called shooting feat, or what?
Yes. Well, I tried to make the question broad then, So, for instance, take the shooting. Could Oswald do that?
Well, a key thing is whether he had 5.6 seconds, which was the scenario the Warren Commission seemed to lean toward. The Warren Commission never explicitly adopted that, but they did tend to lean to that. They believe the first shot was no sooner than Zapruder frame 210. They tended to believe that would hit because they believed the first shot would be accurate because the shooter could line it up well, and then, of course, the last shot is at 313. Or whether, and this is the consensus among lone assassin people these days, he had about 8.4 seconds. The best tests were done by CBS in the 1960s, where they got a Manigault rifle, a moving target on a track, to see if the shooters could match Oswald's supposed shooting feat. It wasn't a perfect recreation, among other things, because first of all, they were told to shoot in 5.6 seconds, not 8.4 seconds. And number two, the question is whether they could get two shots in a head and shoulders torso. The truth is that Oswald or anybody else shooting at Kennedy was almost certainly aiming for a headshot, so the real test would be one headshot. Out of three. The torso shot was essentially a miss. Of the 11 shooters, 6 did that. A lot of the trials were no good because the rifle they had jammed. Two possibilities about that. Number one, it may have been a crankier rifle than Oswald had. It's also the case that the shooters had relatively little time to practice with the rifle, or actually to handle the rifle. They had zero time to practice, I think, but a little time just to work the bolt and get familiar with it. And Oswald, we know, would do things like sit on the back porch of his apartment in New Orleans, dry firing the weapons. So it's possible that even if Oswald was prone to jamming, that he knew the trick. I mean, I think we all know the concept, the trick. We've all had a lock and a key that you have to put it in and pull it out slightly. They matched Oswald's supposed shooting feat, or at least 6 of the 11 did, and I guess that's really the best evidence on that.
Okay, then, Jim, you have 3 minutes.
Oswald's abilities with the rifle were ridiculed by his fellow people in the Marine Corps. Just read about them in Henry Hurt's book. When they heard about it, they said, "Oh, they must have the wrong guy," because this guy was a joke. All right. Craig Roberts and Carlos Hathcock were both excellent shots, and both said it was not possible to do what the Warren Commission said Oswald did. 2 out of 3 direct hits from 60 feet up in 6 seconds at a moving target at a maximum distance of about 260 feet. All right. Carlos Hathcock is a near legendary figure in the military since he recorded something like 90 certified sniping kills during the Vietnam War. So I guess these guys from CBS were a hell of a lot better than the best sniper the military had for a period of 10 years. By the time Oswald left the Marine Corps, he was almost in the reject pile. He was near the bottom, and he just barely made that. The commission knew this, so they made up stuff to cover it up. They said that on the day that he took his test, there were bad weather conditions. Mark Lane looked it up, and the conditions were fine that day. The FBI tried to get Nelson Delgado to change his story about Oswald being a really bad shot. But what makes this even worse is that it's a really bad, inaccurate weapon because of its cheap engineering. But what makes that even worse is that the rifle in evidence is even worse than that because, number one, the bolt was very difficult to open. It was so difficult that it pulled the scope off the mark. Number two, the trigger on that particular rifle was a 2-stage operation. At first it glides, then it gets very difficult. Number 3, the FBI feared firing it because the firing pin was so rusted they thought it was going to break. And number 4, the scope was misaligned, so the bullet flew high and to the right. Okay? Now, Mr. McADAMS tries to get around this last point by saying that Oswald just shoved the thing and that misaligned the scope. Dead wrong. If you look at the picture in the Warren Commission, all right, the rifle is standing on its trigger. The scope is clear. So the scope could not have been misaligned, unless you believe he just threw it there and it landed perfectly on his trigger. Yeah, sure. So now, what do these guys try and do? They try and pull the sequence out to 8 seconds. But yet, this is a real problem is that Kennedy is obscured by the branches of an oak tree. And then if you go beyond that, then there's very little or no indications of shots being fired. Pat Spear demonstrates that very well on his website, and he shows how Vincent Bugliosi went ahead and had to edit some of the witness testimony to come up with anything at all. So how could Oswald possibly do what the Warren Commission says he did with that firing fee? And I won't even go into the whole thing about before and after, his alibi before and after.
15 seconds.
Me, this blows the case out right there.
Okay, John, you have 2 minutes now.
Okay, 2 minutes. Number one, Henry Hurt went out and found a bunch of Marines. Would soon Oswald shoot very soon before very close to the time he left the Marines, and you see a certain amount of Marine macho there. The same with Hathcock, the same with Craig. He said, hey, this guy can't shoot, I can shoot. Oswald, when he left the Marines, was thoroughly demoralized. He wasn't a gung-ho soldier anymore. He frankly didn't care much. He qualified as sharpshooter early on in the Marines, when he was still a fairly gung-ho Marine who, wanted to be a Marine and was happy about being a Marine. He was about an average shooter for a Marine, which is far better than the average male in the population. The weapon was not inaccurate. Frazier bench-fired it, which is the way you test whether a rifle held properly can continually put a bullet in the same place, and it could. It was extremely accurate. It's a standard Italian Army rifle from the 1890s up through World War II. As for the scope being misaligned, Jim says it couldn't have been jammed out of line when it was jammed in the boxes. Whatever it was when it was photographed by Studebaker, we don't know what Oswald did trying to jam it into the boxes. It's also the case that at 87 yards, which was the distance of the headshot, any good shooter, and certainly Oswald, who had shot with iron sights with an M1 rifle in the Marines, could simply use iron sights. If he thought or believed the scope was misaligned, he could have simply used the iron sights. As for the 8 seconds and the oak tree being in the way, the oak tree is not in the way at Zapruder frame 155 and 160. It's pretty good evidence that there was a shot that early, because John Connolly said that he heard a shot and then
15.
turned around to his right, and you see him very sharply turning around, moving his head very, very sharply around in Zapruder frame 164, 165, as if reacting to a shot. And then he said that he was turning toward the front, and you can see that in the Zapruder film too, and when he was hit, like somebody balling up their fist and hitting him in the back, you can see him being hit at Zapruder frame 223. There's perfectly good reason to believe that the first shot was as early as 160. The tree wasn't in the way at 160. I think it was 170 or something later that impeded the shooter.
Okay, that's your time. Jim, you have 2 minutes to respond.
I think he just said that was not an inaccurate rifle, which that to me is kind of mind-boggling. Because, like I said, the FBI did all these tests on it, and they found so many things wrong with it, and they said it was high and to the right. The Warren Commission, by the way, tried to use that as an advantage by saying that would have helped him in the curve down Elm Street. That's how hard up they were. It's a terrible weapon, and anybody can just go ahead. If he knows anybody who has it, or if he knows anybody, if he wants to buy it, you can find out for yourself. It's a horrible, horrible weapon. Now, the shooting test in the Marines, this works against him, because even at his best, he was a low, mediocre shot, because he was in the middle category, but he only barely made that category. The time that he left, he's even worse than that, but that's the time near the assassination. So in other words, even with practice, he was at the best a mediocre shot, at worst a poor shot. When did he practice after he got out of the Marine Corps? There is no credible evidence for that at all, period. And everybody who's a rifleman knows you have to practice to be good. If you go a week or two without practice, you're not going to be good. Okay, he was literally months, without any credible evidence of him practicing, okay? He actually said the iron sights. A guy as bad as Oswald would have had to use the scope, okay? Anybody who's seen the difference between trying to target a rifle with the scope and without the scope knows it makes all the difference in the world. Okay, a guy as bad as Oswald, every shot would have been like the Teg shot, okay, going through the iron sights. He would have had to use a scope. And the stuff he says about 155, again, go to Pat Spear's site. There is no credible evidence at that point that any shots have been fired, okay? But they have to do it because they know Oswald could have never done what the Warren Commission said he did. I'm done.
Okay, and then Jim, the next question is for you, and it is, what was Oswald up to in New Orleans in the summer of '63?
Well, I don't think
minutes.
it's really important what Oswald was up to. I think it's what the people around him were up to, okay? Clearly, when Oswald goes back to New Orleans, he's reunited with a couple of his old friends, David Ferry from the Civil Air Patrol and Kerry Thornley from the Marine Corps. Both of those guys hung out in Guy Bannister's office, and Kerry Thornley actually tried to lie about all the different people who had seen him with Oswald that summer. Okay, both Ferry and Bannister were pals with Clay Shaw, and in fact, a protege of Bannister, Tommy Baumler, later said that Shaw, Bannister, and O&I officer Guy Johnson were the intelligence network out of New Orleans, and Shaw and Ferry were involved with the business enterprise with Freeport Sulphur, which Bannister knew about. Okay, Bannister is involved with the CIA and its anti-Castro efforts, as were both Shaw and Ferry. So when Oswald goes back to New Orleans, the CIA and the FBI are both in the midst of an anti-Fair Play for Cuba campaign. This is certified by John Newman in his book Oswald and the CIA. And the CIA effort was spearheaded by James McCord and David Phillips. So when Ferry introduces Oswald to Bannister, he obviously enlisted him in that effort. As John Newman writes in his book, it's a two-phase operation. First, there's an undercover, low-profile effort, and then there's a public breakout of the low-profile effort later in the summer, which ends up with Oswald getting in the fight with Carlos Briere, going to jail and going to court, etc., and then having those debates with people like CIA asset Ed Butler and Carlos Briere. Okay, this discredits both him and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee as his handlers had planned. But Oswald didn't know about his particular discreditation and how that would be used to incriminate him on the day of the assassination. Then, of course, there's the Clinton-Jackson episode, which goes awry because there's too many people up there who saw him. All right, and it culminates in two ways. The CIA tells the FBI on September the 16th they're going to extend the anti-Fair Play for Cuba Committee operation to a foreign country. And on the next day, Oswald is getting his visa at the Mexican New Orleans consulate. And then finally, Ruth Pein comes down from Virginia after visiting her CIA-employed sister to pick up Marina, and that separates Lee from Marina at the time of the assassination. But more important, it gives Ruth Pein control over Oswald's possessions once he is incarcerated, and boy, did she ever produce. All right, it was a very clever operation, which galled a lot of people into what the hell this guy was really doing, because the Warren Commission, of course, would never admit that he had these clear associations with people like Ferry. I think Ferry's not even in the Warren report, which is unbelievable. Until Jim Garrison started investigating it in 1967, he unearthed all this stuff, and of course, once he did that, the world came down upon his ears.
15 seconds.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay,
John.
You have 3 minutes, John.
Heavens, we have so much Garrisonite nonsense there. First of all, Ferry never worked for the CIA. We know because during the Garrison investigation, the Justice Department asked the CIA, well, who worked for you? We need to know because we need to know what's going to happen. And the CIA basically said, no, we have no file on Ferry. Ferry's never worked for us. They said the CIA said about Bannister, who had been for FBI, gone to New Orleans, run afoul of the civic elite. He was pretty much a rundown character by that time. Well, we considered using him, but we got derogatory information on him. Bannister was such an absurd right-winger, he made Joe McCarthy look like a mellow fellow. So the CIA actually looked at Bannister and decided not to use him. There's really no evidence linking Lee Oswald to David Ferry or to Bannister in 1963 in New Orleans. Conspiracists bring up people like Jack Martin, a guy who Garrison wouldn't even put on the stand because he was so non-credible. His story changed radically. He started out by saying that on the weekend of the assassination that, hey, he had a grudge against Ferry apparently. He called a bunch of people and said, hey, Ferry may have taught Oswald how to shoot a foreign weapon. And then there was this Marine he knew that he said that, he knew a Marine that Ferry had committed an unnatural act with, and that might have been Ferry. That's what he was saying. Then his testimony got better and better and better, and he had Oswald hanging around Bannister's office. And then you have people like Delphine Roberts, who wasn't saying anything about seeing Oswald around Bannister's office to the Garrison investigation in the late 60s, but then in the 70s started telling Tony Summers and started telling the House Select Committee that she saw them together. You get people like David Lewis, who absolutely insisted he saw Oswald with Ferry and Bannister, but he insisted it was in 1962. Well, that was shot out of the water. And as for trying to discredit the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, to actually take that scenario seriously, you have to believe that Oswald was already, in the summer of 1963, marked out as the fellow who was going to be the patsy for shooting John Kennedy, because the Fair Play for Cuba Committee didn't need any discrediting in New Orleans. It was pretty disreputable there. You have to posit that somebody knew that months later Oswald would be set up to be the patsy in shooting Kennedy, and then he would be associated with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and we've discredited the Fair Play for Cuba
15
Committee.
seconds.
When it was just Oswald and his rump chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans on WDSU, public affairs programming, for heaven's sakes, which not many people listen to. It was utterly obscure and of no propaganda use against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. So you have to posit that he had already designated as a patsy long before anybody knew Kennedy was going to Dallas.
Okay, Jim, you have 2 minutes.
Ferry didn't work for the CIA. Okay. 1 week after the Bay of Pigs, he was at Sergio Arcacha Smith's house watching the films of the Bay of Pigs. Sure, who the heck would have those films if the CIA did not? During the ARB, there was a declassified file about David Ferry training Cubans on the eve of the Bay of Pigs, and it was all about the particular type of training, underwater training, because they were thinking of using frogmen going into the Bay of Conchinos, all right? That document is signed by David Phillips. So please don't give me any of this stuff about no connection to the CIA. David Ferry recruited people for the secret war against Castro by telling him, you want to be part of Operation Mongoose. Now, who would know that, the code name of the operation, unless you had some ties to the CIA? Guy Bannister was also in on the Bay of Pigs, because we know this from Gordon Novell, because he recruited Gordon Novell, to work on that project. Okay, Dan Campbell saw Oswald in Bannister's office. Okay, in the summer of 1963, Michael Kurtz saw Bannister with Oswald in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. All right, the FBI scratched out the references in its reports on Oswald that contains the address of 544 Camp Street. That's in John Newman's book. Okay, Delphine Roberts would not tell anything. I mean, it's absurd to say she talked to the Warren Commission, but she wouldn't tell anything to Garrison because she had sworn to Bannister that she would not talk about what had happened there in the summer of 1963. When Tony Summers interviewed her, she still refused to talk because her lawyer advised her not to talk. Then, after the meeting at the lawyer's office, she's standing there in the foyer in the rain. Summers picks her up, offers her a ride. At the first stoplight, she starts weeping. She starts crying, and then she starts talking about Bannister and Oswald. So obviously, she felt very bad about breaking her pledge to her former and now dead friend. Okay? Yeah, it is absurd to go against the FPCC in New Orleans. That's the evidence that it was really a double-level operation, one against the unknowing Oswald and once against the FPCC. Okay, I'm done.
Right. Okay, John, you have 2 minutes.
Ferry is recruiting Frogman is utterly ridiculous. He did have a fuel drop tank from a B-47 in his backyard. He said he was going to convert into a submarine, which he wasn't capable of doing. Ferry had a doctor's degree. It was a mail-order diploma from an Italian university. As for Gordon Novell wasn't with the CIA. Gordon Novell is one of those people who told lots and lots of tall tales that a lot of people have eaten up. The actual internal CIA documents say they considered Bannister, and he was no use. The Campbell story, at least as it's recounted in Tony Summers' book Conspiracy, simply says that, quote, a Marine that on the day that Oswald was arrested, and apparently the word of that got back to Bannister's office, that a Marine came into the office. And Tony Summers makes the connection that it was Oswald, but of course Oswald was in jail at that time, so it's difficult to know what to make of the Campbell story. As for Kurtz, there's a little problem there. In the second edition of his book, he said he saw Oswald with Bannister in Ferry. In the first edition of his book, he said no such thing. His response when confronted on this was, well, I didn't think it mattered. I didn't think it made any difference. I didn't think it was of any significance. And there simply fundamentally is no evidence that Oswald interacted with Ferry or Bannister in the summer of 1942. At a 15-year-old, yeah, he definitely was in Ferry's CAP unit.
Okay. That's the halfway point.
I didn't get to rebut him.
Oh.
Well, if we're going to be fair, he had a, wait a minute, didn't Jim start on this? Didn't he?
Yeah, you did start, Jim, so I think we're even.
Yeah.
No, wait a minute. I thought the procedure was 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and 2 minutes.
Right.
I thought that's what, did we go through it all?
But you started.
Yeah, you started, Jim, and we've gone back and forth. I'll, if you want, I'll give you each another 2 minutes. If you have something to add, we could do that.
All I did was my opening statement. I didn't get to rebut. Now, what I'm going to say, if he wants to rebut it, to be fair, that's fine.
Okay, fine. Take another 2 minutes, and John, you'll have 2 minutes to reply.
Okay. Like I said, the idea that it's ridiculous, David Phillips' signature, I mean, this is a guy who praises signatory writing, is on the document. Okay? All right? Okay. Gordon Novell, I mean, I've seen the letters that Gordon Novell wrote to Richard Helms. Okay, so it's ridiculous to say Novell had no connection, with the CIA. I interviewed Dan Campbell, okay, twice, once in New Orleans and once in Los Angeles, all right? Okay, he told me the same story both times. It was Oswald who came in to use the phone that day, all right? And they could tell he was a Marine just by the way he walked and his stature because Campbell was a military guy, all right? The day of the assassination, him and his brother are watching TV. They see Oswald's picture, and they both go into hiding because they understand, wait a minute, hold it. This guy cannot be a communist if he was in Guy Bannister's office, all right? Okay? Now, you want to discredit Michael Kurtz? Fine. What about William Gaudet? Said he saw the same thing, all right? Finally, by the way, Summer of 42 was a movie. We're talking about the summer of 1963, all right? If this is all a bunch of malarkey, why did Oswald stamp several pieces of literature with 544 Camp Street? Okay, and then the FBI tried to conceal that in its documents later. Okay, it's not malarkey. There's just too many witnesses, that saw Oswald, with those guys, both in the Clinton-Jackson area, and in New Orleans. All right, I'm sorry, it won't go away, and you can't wish it away. All right, even Robert Blakey bought that story. All right, so go ahead. Here's 2 minutes.
Okay,
sure, Gordon Novell. I'm sure I've seen letters he wrote to Helms. The problem is Helms didn't write any letters to him. He was a crackpot. Internal CIA documents say Gordon Novell had no connection to the CIA. If Campbell is telling a somewhat different and better story now than the one he told it to Tony Summers, okay, yes, people's stories do tend to get better over time. That harms their credibility. As for Gaudet, his whole account of seeing Oswald and what I think Ferry or Bannister or both together was a relatively late appearing thing. I don't think it happened during the era of the Warren Commission. It happened during the years later with the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And then let's talk about the Clinton-Jackson witnesses. The House Select Committee on Assassinations did not have the earliest documents from the New Orleans District Attorney's Office that show the Clinton-Jackson witnesses to be very, very vague. I mean, Corey Collins, for example, there's a clear paper trail. And the first time Mou Chambra showed him a picture of Oswald, he identified Oswald. Then Mou Chambra showed him a picture of Ferry, and Collins said, well, I may have seen him around somewhere. He looks familiar. Then he showed, Chambra showed Corey Collins a picture of Shaw, and he says, well, he looks familiar. I think I've seen him around. Then under coaching, and I don't think necessarily the Garrison staff was dishonest about this, but it's easy, as an investigator, to create the evidence you want. Then under, continual coaching and being asked to make identifications of people. Corey Collins' testimony got very, very good, and he got on the stand in New Orleans, and said, sure enough, yes, I saw Oswald, and I saw Ferry, and I saw Clay Shaw, but you got to go back and look at the very first statements,
15 seconds.
Which Joe Posner did, and which Pat Lambert did.
Okay, gentlemen, we're at the halfway point. All right, everyone, that was the first half of this debate, and we'll be back next week with the second half.
Now here is your host, Leno Sanek.
Control room, you're on the air.
Hello, everyone. This is Len Osanek. Welcome to another episode of Black Op Radio. We are continuing with the JFK research debate between Jim DiEugenio and John McADAMS, and I believe we have them both on the line. John, are you there?
Oh, I'm here.
And Jim, are you there?
Yes, I am.
We're going to kick right into it. Oh, I did want to mention one thing. We had to, for no other reason than one of the guests was busy, that we just had to postpone the debate, so there was something that went wrong. I actually was working on my phone system, and I still got a few bugs to work out of it, but that's why we just postponed it a week, just scheduling problem. It's good in one respect, because last time we took about 2 hours for 10 questions. We have another 10 questions. Approximately, I'd estimate we are going to be probably 2 hours here, so I think any debate 4 hours would have been too long for one night, so I think it's worked out. Probably attracted more interest anyway. Look, I believe John went first last time with the first question, so I guess we should offer it to Jim to start first. But before we start, is there any unfinished questions or anything from last week that we had to address? I think we kind of resolved everything at that point.
No, I thought everything evened out.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say resolve, but we probably should let that drop. And I mean, I could quarrel with 2 or 3 things that Jim said. He could probably quarrel with 2 or 3 things that I said. Probably should just let it drop and move on.
Right. Yeah. No, I meant to offer you if there was something unfinished that somehow. The only thing I recall last time that it was more or less my encouragement that we end the debate, and I don't think it was either parties or anybody chicking it out or anything like that. It was just I said, listen, instead of taking a halftime break, it was on me that I just stopped it. So saying that, let's continue. So we're going to start with the first question. I'll start that off. The commission claimed that Oswald took the rifle from the Pein garage the morning of 11/22 with the intent of killing President Kennedy. What evidence is there that the rifle was in the Pein garage on November 21st? And I guess, Jim, you can start off with that.
Well, there is little or no evidence to put the rifle at the Pein garage. The commission tried desperately to show that some kind of package was carried from New Orleans back to Dallas that looked even a tiny bit like a long, slim stick. And if you read this stuff, it gets almost comical how hard Mr. Jenner tries in this regard with Ruth Pein and Lillian Murrett, but, he can't get any kind of positive response. Then Ford and Jenner tried hard to get some testimony about something being unloaded in Irving at the Peins, which resembled such a package, but he came up, empty there. And in fact, Ruth Pein said that she didn't even recall the blanket appearing until later, after the first week of October, all right, which is a very curious statement. And then, of course, came the hump. The hump, this was a tent-like projection in the blanket made by an object about 10 inches in length. And Agent Stonebaugh said this, that the object itself was 10 inches long. So the commission was so hard up that they turned this into the scope of a much larger object, of course, was the rifle, which apparently made no other impressions, on the blanket. And then, of course, there was Cadigan, who said he couldn't find anything on the alleged paper bag, that said anything was, to betray the presence of a rifle. And then besides,
Besides this, it basically comes down to Marina, who said she saw somehow the stock of a rifle, which, in my opinion, Marina has very little credibility, if any, from her Warren Commission days. Michael Pein said it looked like a folding shovel. But, here's the question. If Oswald was planning on shooting JFK, why would he leave the rifle at the Pein household when he could have taken it to his apartment, where he could have actually, done some practice shooting? It's a much more logical thing to do. And this is the problem, is that nobody actually, in the whole summer and fall of 1963, can ever remember him practicing with that rifle. If you read Marina Oswald's original testimony, she said she didn't remember anything like that. Her testimony changed over time if you read the records under pressure from the Secret Service and the FBI, when they made it clear to her that she was going to have to cooperate or they were going to threaten her. Well, they actually did threaten her with deportation. So, in my opinion, it's a pretty dry hole. Okay, and I'll pass that on to Mr. McADAMS.
All right. After the assassination, Dallas cops, led by Gus Rose, come out to the Pein residence, and they're obviously asking questions and looking around, and they ask if there's any gun, a rifle, any other firearm there. Ruth Pein, good Quaker lady, says no, because she wouldn't have tolerated it if there was. Marina says, well, Ruth translates for Marina, and Marina says yes, in the garage. So they all go out in the garage. Gus Rose sees the blanket, which Marina says the rifle is wrapped up in. He picks it up, and it simply flops over in his hands. There's nothing in there. He says, when I picked it up, it fell limp across my arm. At that point, Marina let out an audible gasp. I turned and looked at her and noticed she was wide-eyed and pale. I thought for a moment that she was about to faint. Now, Jim points out that the FBI, at least implicitly, threatened Marina with deportation if she didn't cooperate. Interestingly, the Secret Service was worried that she'd leave the country, which sounds more like the federal government that people like me know and don't particularly love, than like Jim's exceedingly evil, entirely monolithic, and exceedingly competent federal government. At any rate, Marina is taken down to police headquarters. This is before the FBI, Secret Service, or anybody with the Dallas police question her, and she signs a statement. She says, when the police came to her house, I told them that he used to have a rifle to hunt with in Russia. I knew there was a rifle in Mrs. Payne's garage. 2 weeks ago, I was in the garage and saw the same blanket that the police got. I opened the blanket and saw a rifle in it. This blanket is the same one I saw today in the same place. Today is the first time I saw the blanket empty. Today at the police station, they showed me a rifle. It was like the rifle my husband had. It was a dark gun, but I don't remember the sight on it. It could be the same rifle, but I'm not sure. This is before the cops talk to her. It's interesting that Jim mentions, I forget what he mentioned about the paper bag. He didn't mention that it had Oswald's palm print and fingerprint on it. Two rather important pieces of evidence. As for the FBI threatening Marina, I'll point out that it is quite routine for interrogators to threaten witnesses that they think are withholding something. If you start with the assumption that the FBI was intent on a cover-up, that all the agents questioning her knew exactly what they had to cover up, then that is sinister. If you don't start with that assumption, what you have is investigators doing what investigators need to do, which is to say, get the witness to open up and tell the truth. Where all her key factual testimony is concerned...
15 seconds.
That is... What's that? 15 seconds?
Yeah, roughly.
Factual testimony, whether Oswald shot at Walker, the backyard photos, etc. Marina continued to assert the truth of that testimony to Priscilla McMillan, to the House Select Committee on Assassination, and on and on.
Jim, you have 2 minutes to reply.
Well, what can you say? Anybody who's going to try and bolster the credibility of Marina Oswald, I mean, this is a woman who told one story one time, then changed her story before the Warren Commission, then changed her story, for the House Select Committee, and then has a different story to tell today. I mean, it's very clear what she said about the FBI because it's right in the Warren Commission. They said I had to cooperate with them. I didn't want to answer their questions, but I had to cooperate with them, or that they would send me back to Russia. I mean, it's in my Part 7 of my Bugliosi piece. I extracted that testimony. Now, about the bag, well, again, this is something we went over last time. Which bag is he talking about? There's like 3 bags. You know, he can't. To think how ridiculous this is. If we're supposed to believe that Oswald took this bag from the depository, then he wrapped this rifle in the bag, and then he taped the rifle. And that whole process of bringing it back and then taking it back to the depository, unwrapping it, he got exactly 1 fingerprint and 1 palm print on the bag. It's utterly ridiculous. And then, even to do that, the Dallas police couldn't get anything off the bag. The FBI had to do 3 different tests to get anything at all off the bag. And today, after all this confusion, we don't know what bag they got it off of. Even Jesse Curry in his book says, well, it's probably found there. And he actually said that twice. About the Walker, I can't believe he brought up the Walker shooting. Because, you know, the Walker shooting, of course, a big problem with that is if you believe Marina on that, then you have to believe Oswald had a different rifle. Because the bullet that was fired in the Walker's house could not have come from the Mannlicher Carcano. That bullet changed in both color, shape, and caliber
15
once
seconds.
the FBI got into the case. Okay, I'll stop there.
Oswald wrote a note
Okay.
intended to Marina describing what she should do if he was caught or captured or killed on the evening of the Walker shooting. Jim says Marina changed her story multiple times. Not really. Read her House Select Committee on Assassination testimony. Read what she told Priscilla McMillan. Read what she was saying to this day about the backyard photos. She said Oswald did say he went to Mexico City. She told Oprah in the 1990s, yes, Oswald shot at Walker. And let's see, what else? Mexico City, Walker, backyard photos, etc. So I'm not aware their testimony has changed in any substantial way since the Warren Commission. She did initially withhold information. I think that's clear. But she has not recanted her Warren Commission testimony in spite of the fact that there is just flat out no fear she could possibly have of being deported, could not have before the House Select Committee, certainly can't today. So if it was all a pack of lies, why hasn't she recanted it? She says that her now believes her husband's innocent, but she hasn't recanted any of her key factual testimony. As for prints on the bags, Jim seems to believe that if you handle anything, you're going to get multiple prints on it. That's not necessarily the case. In a majority of cases where cops know that a criminal handled a firearm, they don't actually find fingerprints. It's worth trying to check for, but it's simply not the case that you always find fingerprints when somebody has handled a gun. Conspiracy theorists really need to occasionally read for standard forensics textbooks. That is to say, textbooks that have no dog in the hunt where the Kennedy assassination is concerned.
15
and just
seconds.
talk about forensics principles.
Right. Okay, then. Let's leave that then. We'll go on to the next question, which is then for you, John, and it will be, is there any proof beyond reasonable doubt that Oswald and Oswald alone fired the magic bullet?
Well, the other part you have assumes that it hit him from the front. First of all, the bullet, which was found on Connolly's stretcher, matched Oswald's rifle to the exclusion of all other weapons. Now, obviously, conspiracists all insist that this was planted or something. It's difficult to see why any conspiracy would plant a bullet before 1:50 p.m. on the day of the assassination, when they had no idea how many other bullets would be recovered. For all they knew, a planted bullet matched to Oswald's rifle would simply be one bullet too many. It would be the one bullet that proved that there were more than 3 shots, and that Oswald couldn't have fired all the shots. There were also less controversial and less often mentioned 2 sizable fragments, presumably of the headshot, found in the front of the presidential limo. They were large enough to be matched to Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano to the exclusion of all other weapons. Now, if you want to come up with a theory that says Oswald took his Mannlicher Carcano into the depository and handed it over to some conspiracy shooter, it's difficult to refute that. I suppose that's possible, except the FBI questioned every depository employee, literally every one, about anyone they'd seen in the depository besides fellow employees that day. And one man, elderly man, had come in to go to the restroom, and that's the only person anybody saw in the depository other than employees. So the evidence really does start very, and I mean, obviously, in addition to the bullets of the 3 spent cartridges found in the sniper's nest, matched to Oswald's rifle, to the exclusion of all other weapons, and on and on and on. So it's difficult to prove a negative. That is, it's difficult to prove that, it wasn't somebody besides Oswald. But you really have to make a bunch of stuff up to believe that. Far and away, the simplest theory is that the guy who owned the rifle, the guy who brought the rifle into work, the guy who was out of sight during the shooting, unlike the vast majority of depository employees, is actually the guy who was doing the shooting.
Right. Okay. Well, that's your first 3 minutes then. So, Jim, you have 3 minutes to reply.
Well, I can't believe he said that bullet was found on Connolly's stretcher, because if you take a look at Tomlinson till the day he died, said that Arlen Specter twisted his words beyond recognition, that the stretcher he described clearly belongs, and Tink Thompson proved this, in my opinion, beyond a reasonable doubt, to a little kid named Ronald Fuller. Specter understood that would be poison for the Warren Commission, so he deliberately led Tomlinson, and anybody who reads the interview can see that this guy's leading the witness. In any kind of court of law, Specter would have been thrown out of court for the kind of tactics he was using in that case. It was not found on Connolly's stretcher. Why would anybody plant a bullet at that? Why would anybody plant a bullet at that time? Well, here's the question: we don't even know if that's the bullet that Elmer Lee Todd gave to Frazier at FBI headquarters that night, because Elmer Lee Todd picked up this alleged bullet from the White House at 8:50. If you look at Frazier's the FBI expert who was called in that night to do the analysis. If you look at his lab report, he says he received the bullet at 7:30. Now, here's my obvious question. How could he receive the bullet from Todd at 7:30 when Todd didn't get the bullet till an hour and 20 minutes later? And the FBI lied about the initials on that bullet, because in the Warren Commission, it says Todd's initials are on that bullet. They are not on that bullet, and John Hunt took a magnifying glass and a microscope down to the National Archives, and he proved that Todd's initials are not on that bullet. I love the way he talks about these two fragments. This is incredible, because what he leaves out, of course, is that the two fragments are the head and the tail of a bullet. And he doesn't ask the obvious question: where did the middle go? If you believe Michael Bauden, which he believes, the middle of the bullet is in the back of JFK's skull, which means, of course, that now he's got a second magic bullet. He's got this bullet that comes in high in the cowlick area, splits into 3 parts. The middle part stays there. The back of the bullet somehow goes up in an elevator above the middle part that's still in JFK's head, and bounces through his head and joins the front of the bullet in the front of the car. Now, some people might believe one magic bullet. Who could possibly believe 2 of them? But that's what you have to believe if you believe what he's saying. All right? About any conspirators, well, how about the guy that Baker saw the first day? Marion Baker's first day affidavit before the Warren Commission and the other people dry cleaned and altered his testimony.
15
he talks
seconds.
about a guy on the 4th floor that he saw, okay, who had a brown jacket on and was not Oswald, because he didn't ID Oswald that day. Where did that guy go? He disappeared. Okay.
Okay, good. All right, John, you have 2 minutes.
So I have no idea about what he's talking about on the guy on the 4th floor. I know the depository employees didn't see anyone, and Baker could have certainly run into any depository employee and not recognize the person. Remember, he didn't work in the depository. As for the 2 bullet fragments, we know what happened to the bullet when it hit Kennedy's head. It shattered. In the X-rays, both the lateral and the AP, that's anterior-posterior X-rays, you can see numerous fragments in Kennedy's brain. And then we have 2 fragments in the front seat, one of which probably made the ding in the chrome topping on the windshield. But if you put all that together, John Latimer calculated, and I believe him on this, I'm sure Jim doesn't believe him on anything under the sun, but I certainly believe him on this, only a minority of the mass of that bullet is accounted for. In other words, most of it clearly shattered, and most of the mass of the bullet simply was blown out into Dealey Plaza with Kennedy's brain matter and pieces of Kennedy's skull, and it was a god-awful mess. Jim, obviously, conspiracists always question the chain of evidence, blah, blah. I mean, some discrepancies in notes can simply be errors. Somebody makes a mistake. That happens all the time. It doesn't really affect the chain of evidence if you either have initials or you have a chain of witnesses, each of which will testify, well, I got this from I gave this to so-and-so, and then so-and-so gets on the stand and testifies, well, I give that to so-and-so, and then the second so-and-so gets on the stand and say, yeah, here's my initials. Unless Jim, I mean, whatever bullet Jim wants to claim was found and wherever it was found, the question still remains why. For example, if it wasn't a bullet that matched Oswald's rifle, gosh, why would anyone plant it there? Presumably the conspirators wanted to frame Oswald's rifle. It's almost impossible to believe that a bullet would have been planted that didn't match Oswald's rifle. And again, the question is, it's terribly risky. It could be the 4th or 5th bullet recovered.
Okay, Jim, you have 2 minutes then.
The guy I talked about is right in Marion Baker's first day affidavit, and I quoted it in my part 6 of my review of Bugliosi's book, which obviously he has failed to read so far. Now, the stuff he did with Latimer, look, both the Ramsey-Clark panel and the HSCA panel, and again, these are the guys he believes. They said, and David Mantic has confirmed this, and it's a 6.5 millimeter fragment. And you can see it on the AP, and you can see it on the lateral. It's 6.5. Perfect. Which, by the way, another thing he doesn't add, that 6.5 fragment was not visible to hardly any, well, I don't think anybody saw it the night of the original autopsy. So whatever he wants to say, that thing is the middle of the bullet. How did it stay there when the front and back went through JFK's head? Donahue says it couldn't happen. Errors in the notes. Okay, we're supposed to believe that on the biggest homicide case that Frazier ever worked on in his life, which he was, by the way, he was called in to work that night, that he made this mistake twice because he wrote down 7:30 2 times. And we're supposed to believe that Elmer Lee Todd didn't look at the clock at the White House before he wrote down 8:50. All right? And then he talks about chain of, that's the last thing he wants to bring up. Because O.P. Wright did not recognize that bullet when Thompson showed it to him. Tomlinson did not recognize that bullet when Thompson showed it to him. The 2 Secret Service guys, okay, who got the bullet, Johnson and Rowley, failed to recognize a bullet when Hoover asked them to. And then Hoover and Bardwell Odom cooperated on a deception story, which is there for everybody to see that he showed it to Wright when, in fact, Tink Thompson and Gary Aguilar asked him about this. He said, I never showed that bullet to O.P. Wright. Hoover knew it was the wrong bullet, and that's why he set up that story. I'm done.
Right. Okay. The next question, then, is, I guess, back to you then, Jim. And it would be, why would Oswald want JFK dead? And you have 3 minutes. That's a really good question. Because by all the evidence we have, and this guy's standing up for Marina, so he has to buy this, he actually liked Kennedy. And he actually feared a coup would come to overthrow him, which he talked about in the speech he gave in Mobile, Alabama, which is excerpted in Jim Douglas's book. All right, so how much did he like JFK? He actually read books by Kennedy and about Kennedy. And get this, he even checked books out at the library because Kennedy had read them, okay, and liked those books. And also, he didn't like the attacks on Adlai Stevenson in Dallas, and he condemned anti-Catholic remarks at an ACLU meeting. He also told his wife that Kennedy was moving towards disarmament, and he wanted to pursue a gentler policy with Cuba
but that was difficult to do because of the circumstances, in which, of course, he ended up being right on that in both counts. The Warren Commission never could find any credible motive for Oswald to kill JFK, and it's actually one of the most pathetic parts of the Warren Report. Wesley Liebler actually laughed about, he wrote this, by the way, he actually laughed about it when Stone's movie came out because he actually wrote that section. When the commission sent him up to his cabinet in Vermont, to find a motive, he was completely lost. He ended up calling Robert Oswald on, I think, August the 18th, 1 month before the report was due, trying to, probe his brain for anything. Yeah, and like I said, if you read it, it's actually one of the worst parts of the report. If he's a communist, why would he kill Kennedy? Most people knew that LBJ was more of a Cold Warrior than Kennedy, and he proved it with Vietnam. Kennedy was the most liberal president since FDR. Both Castro and Khrushchev were very upset when JFK died, and they both were worried about a right-wing coup, if that had taken place. Or if you believe, as I do, that Oswald was an intelligence operative, he'd be the last guy you would pick to kill somebody from that distance at a moving target with a rifle simply because his shooting skills were so horrendous. Which this opens up an interesting question 46 years later, because there's no convincing answer that you could have ever put forth at any kind of a prosecution. And like I said, these kind of things don't happen in a normal murder case. Usually there's even Bugliosi says, although motive is not necessary, you really should have it in order to convince the jury that the guy committed the crime. Here, I've been studying this case for too long. I can't find any. I'm done.
Okay, John, you have 3 minutes.
Sure. First of all, John Kennedy was not the most liberal president. Actually, he was not the most liberal president since FDR. Truman was, although Truman was very much a Cold Warrior. He was just pretty far to the left on domestic policy. LBJ was, in fact, quite a bit more liberal than John Kennedy. Kennedy, for example, was late and slow getting on the civil rights train. Admittedly, once he did, he used some quite excellent rhetoric and spoke very eloquently in favor of civil rights, but in fact he was slow. That wasn't initially his agenda. Lyndon Johnson was really passionate both about civil rights and about his war on poverty. Now, as far as Oswald's motives, there are two possible motives, two very different theories that are, however, consistent. Number one, Castro was saying, he said, for example, to an AP reporter, he was talking about Kennedy assassination plots on his life, and he actually issued a kind of threat in one of the interviews. It was, if memory serves, late in the summer of '63, that, hey, this could backfire on John Kennedy. It did appear, Gene Davison has shown, it did appear in the newspaper in New Orleans. Oswald may have read it. We certainly know that Oswald was reading left-wing newspapers that most certainly would have given credence to the idea that the Kennedy administration was trying to overthrow Castro, was an enemy of Castro. Jim seems to think that Kennedy was this sort of liberal or left-winger. From the standpoint of someone like Oswald, Kennedy would have been, well, tolerable, but still way too hawkish and way too intent on either tossing Castro out of power or out-and-out killing him. Another factor was simply that Oswald was convinced that he was going to be an historically important figure. When he came back from the Soviet Union, he called his memoir of his experiences there his historic diary. It really wasn't a diary. It was written in a couple of settings, but he called it historic. He expected to be an historic person. He once told Marina he expected to be prime minister. Obviously, in the U.S., being prime minister would require pretty radical change of government. So if he was someone who wanted to be historically important, and particularly if he was someone who viewed himself as a sort of volunteer protector of the Cuban Revolution, and we know he was very enamored of the Cuban Revolution. He was trying to get into Cuba. That's what he was doing in
15
Mexico
seconds.
City. It's certainly reasonable to believe that he viewed himself as protecting Castro's revolution.
Okay. Jim, you have 2 minutes.
The Harker story that he's using, this thing has been so used by these guys that it has mildew all over it. Even in Bugliosi's book, he knows that there's two different versions of that story. Okay, they've been transmuted over time. They want to use the more extreme one, and by the way, there's no proof that Oswald ever saw that story, okay, as opposed to the other one, which, by the way, Castro himself later disputed. Okay, this is right in Bugliosi's book. Now, as far as the Castro revolution, Oswald comes back from Russia. He doesn't get into this Cuba thing until, I think, right before he left Dallas. He brings it up, of course, right when he hits New Orleans during the Fair Play for Cuba campaign by the FBI and the CIA. And now he ignores that coincidence and somehow says that Oswald is somehow infatuated with Cuba. He's so infatuated with Cuba that he didn't have his credentials together when he went down to Mexico City to get there. Okay, that's how infatuated, and he could have done it easily by working through the Russian and Cuban embassies in Washington. Okay, that's how infatuated he was with Cuba. He didn't even know how to get there. And everybody knows that the back channel that Kennedy was working on for about a year now, about 11 months, to raise his détente with Cuba. And this is why Castro was so upset when Kennedy died, because he literally said to June Daniel, he said, it's over. You know, everything we've been working on now is now going to be over. And the first question he asked, what's Johnson's relationship with the CIA? So in my view, this is nothing but camouflage, you know, because these guys have never, ever been the historic diary. Yeah, for sure. He wanted to go down in history. That's why he denied he ever did it. Okay? It's so inconsistent. It's so paradoxical. They can't pull this together. And they never have been, and they never will. I mean, just ask Wesley, well, too bad, Liebler is dead, but he could have told you that a long time ago. Okay, I'm done.
Right. Okay, John, you have 2 minutes to reply then?
Yeah, I wasn't aware that Oswald ever denied writing the historic diary. It doesn't matter whether he denied it or not. The handwriting is clearly his. As for the coincidence thing, Jim seems to think there's something sinister about that. When he was in Dallas, his project was to knock off right-wing General Edwin Walker, and when he failed in that and left Dallas, he simply turned to another project of self-aggrandizement. Oswald always had a project of self-aggrandizement. Now, in terms of having his credentials together, Oswald thought he had his credentials together. Oswald wasn't the most sophisticated person in the whole world, but he took to Mexico City what is called his revolutionary resume that tried to portray himself as an important lefty activist. For example, he put out lecturer because, yes, indeed, he had talked at the Jesuit house at Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. You know, street agitator because he handed out leaflets, and he said he had infiltrated the anti-Castro forces, I forget what term he used for them, and used the information he got to harass them. So he went down with what he thought were credentials. Now, as for Kennedy's back-channel approach to Fidel Castro, that's true, but it was also secret. And it's very unlikely Oswald would have known of that. Certainly the left-wing press he was reading, the Militant and the Worker, would not have known about that and viewed Kennedy as an implacable enemy of Castro. So, you know, Oswald would have had to know about that publicly. Remember, Kennedy had gone to Miami and told Cuban exiles. He displayed a free Cuban flag, a non-communist Cuban flag, and said this flag will fly over Havana, which you could only interpret as as a promise to overthrow Castro's regime one way or another.
Okay, we'll leave that question and we'll move on. Question 4 is, did Hoover proclaim Oswald guilty before or after the FBI examined any of the evidence? And that's for you, John.
Hoover was passing along whatever information he could. Quite often it was disinformation, misinformation. Disinformation implies he was, intentionally lying for some reason. This was simply misinformation. There's a memo that he wrote dated 4:01 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963. It says, I called the Attorney General at his home, and I told him I thought we had the man who killed the president down in Dallas at the present time, and the man's name is Lee Harvey Oswald. That was what he was saying at 4:01 p.m. He also said said that Oswald apparently left the building and a block or two away ran into two police officers and thinking that they were going to arrest him, shot them and killed one of them with a sidearm. He then said the Attorney General, that is Bobby, asked if Oswald is a communist, and I said that he's not a communist but has communist leanings. I related that Oswald went to Russia and stayed 3 years, came back to the United States, went to Cuba on several occasions but would not tell us why he went to Cuba. In other words, what you have is Hoover passing along whatever information, or in this case misinformation, he thought he had, and a lot of it was just flat out wrong. Now, Jim's probably ingenious enough to claim. And then even a week later, he talked to the president on November 29th, wrote a memo for his subordinates at the Bureau dated 1:39 p.m., and even there he had a huge amount of misinformation in the memo. He repeated the thing about running into a police officer near the depository. He said the gun was found on the 5th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. If you actually listen to Hoover, he's portrayed as this sinister figure, and in certain ways he was, but when dealing with powerful people like Bobby Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson, he was pretty much a suck-up. So what he would do would be call them up and pass along whatever information he could, and typically it was misinformation. On that Friday, by the way, he passed along the information that a bullet had fallen out of Kennedy's head on the way to the hospital. I don't know, maybe Jim can make that seem like some part of a conspiracy theory. Frankly, he was just clueless. So he was passing along what information he had when he was passing it along.
Okay, Jim, you have 3 minutes.
Well, it's interesting that he mentioned those phone calls, but he doesn't say what he said. The first time he called Bobby Kennedy, and by the way, he never called Bobby Kennedy at his house. This day he did. He said something words to the effect, "Your brother's been shot," and that was about it. And about an hour or so later, he said, "Your brother's dead," and he hung up. Right after this, he took RFK's direct line into his office, who he was the first Attorney General who ever put that into his office, and he told his secretary, "Take that thing out of here and put it on your desk. It doesn't belong here anymore." This is Hoover's, and see, this is what Mr. McAdams likes to leave out. This was the reason, of course, that Hoover did this role in the cover-up. He despised the Kennedys, and RFK hated his guts. RFK actually called him a little bit of a psycho. When Hoover ever talked about RFK to his friends on vacation, he would go off the wall. The two guys despised each other, and this was his opportunity, to get rid of this forever. Him and Johnson were the best of friends because they had more affinities in common than he did with the Kennedys. And how do we know this? Because the next day, Saturday, where does Hoover go? You think he'd go to FBI headquarters. You think maybe he would conduct the investigation from his house. He went to the racetrack, okay, and he used the phone in the racetrack with Clyde Tolson going down and placing bets for him. That's how concerned he was about this investigation. All right, then, of course, when Oswald is killed, this, of course, changes everything, all right, and he goes ahead and he writes this memo. The thing I'm concerned about is that we have something issued so we can, quote, convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin. In other words, it doesn't matter if he is or not. We have to convince the public that he is. This, by the way, precedes the Katzenbach memo. So he also told Johnson essentially the same thing. And all you got to do is look at the first FBI report. That thing is a joke. See, it's so bad that the Warren Commission wouldn't put it in the volumes. Now, can you imagine how bad it must have been? It says Tippit was hit with 3 bullets. Now, this is not the day of the assassination. This is like December the 9th. This is over 2 weeks later. These guys still can't get a good story together. And out of those 100 pages, about 50 of them are Priscilla Johnson kind of stuff. It's basically a smear of Oswald. If you can believe it, in the FBI report of December the 9th, George de Mohrenschildt is not named in the index, and neither is Roy Vaughn, the guy who the Dallas police pinned the assassination of Oswald on. J. Lee Rankin even understood exactly what had happened. Okay?
15 seconds.
He said, look, these guys did not follow out the leads. They just slapped this thing together. Okay? And they want us to ratify it. Again, it's too horrible for even the Warren Commission. Case closed.
Okay, John, you have 2 minutes.
Sure. It's interesting that conspiracists will always say that all the Warren Commission did was just ratify the FBI version of events, and now Jim's telling us they didn't do that at all. As for the FBI report, which is Commission Document 1, that was actually pretty good, considering how quickly it had to be put together, first take on what happened. The Warren Commission simply went back over all that territory in much greater depth with, for example, not only using FBI reports, but testimony they took. So it wasn't a bad report given how quickly it had been put together, but the Warren Commission's job was to basically study the whole thing, and they certainly did not just adopt it. So conspiracists are making what appears to me to be contradictory arguments here. I'm not sure what else to say that's relevant. It is true, absolutely, that Bobby and Hoover didn't like each other. On the other hand, Bobby went along with certain things Hoover wanted to do, like tapping the phones of Martin Luther King. Bobby was not exactly this, paladin of civil liberties and justice. Bobby had, when Steel Company executives defied John Kennedy's orders, where Kennedy had no authority to give Steel Company executives orders, they descended on all the Steel Company executives and said, "We're going through all your books, we're going through your tax returns, we're going to get you," which is simply a misuse of the power of the federal government to try to intimidate people who have defied what the administration wants. Bobby was very much a party to that.
15 seconds.
Although they hated each other, it wasn't that Bobby was the great liberal and believer in civil liberties. He wasn't.
Okay, Jim, you have 2 minutes.
I really have to sit down. These guys, this is always what they do. If you can't win the case on the merits, what do? You smear the victim. So now he drags in this anti-Kennedy stuff. What does he leave out? Kennedy was going to fire Hoover, and that's in Kurt Gentry's book, and it's Anthony Summers' book. And Hoover understood that. He says they didn't like each other. If you fire somebody, I think it goes beyond not liking somebody. Okay? All right? And then he drags in this thing about the tapping of King, and he leaves out the total context. One of the reasons Kennedy was going to fire Hoover was because he got sick and tired of all the tactics that Hoover was using to drive a wedge between himself and King. All this stuff about this communist conspiracy that was controlling King. Okay, so Kennedy said, okay, look, if you're right, then I'll go ahead and I'll okay that tap for 1 month. And if you come up with nothing, then that's it. It's all over for your case. Well, unfortunately, at the end of the month, what happened? His brother got killed. Okay? And so with Johnson left it on, and by the way, the great liberal he says Johnson is, Johnson listened to those phony sex tapes that Hoover had of King, and he played them for his friends in his office. The same kind of thing that Bobby Kennedy marched into Hoover's office and said, get rid of that stuff right now. I want every single one of them back in your office by sundown tonight. Okay? So this is just a despicable tactic on his part. If you're going to say that stuff, then make sure you get your facts straight. All right? Okay, that's it.
Okay, well, Jim, the next question is for you then, though. And question 5, can anyone name Oswald's communist associates in the U.S. and any group affiliations?
Well, if the word associate is used in a normal sense, no. Okay. Now, it's true that he did write communist groups in the North, but what he told them was this basically fairy tale stuff about meetings he was having, which, of course, never happened, about the activities of his buddy Alex Heidel, who did not exist, and he talked about confrontations with anti-Castro Cubans before they happened. Now, if you don't think Oswald was nuts, as I do not, then what kind of person does that kind of stuff? Well, it's the same kind of guy who writes a letter about himself being in Mexico City when he wasn't, and he includes information in that letter that he could not have known of at the time that he was there. And, of course, it's somebody who's striking a pose. But try and find any kind of communist cell that Oswald was associated with, around him. Nobody's been able to do that. And please don't tell me it was because of Southern State, because there was a Communist Party in Texas. The secretary was a guy named Stanford. And you know what he told Ralph Yarborough? He said Oswald's a CIA agent. So he couldn't catch on to any communist cell because these guys all knew that he was a provocateur. I mean, you don't do the kind of stuff Oswald did, if you're not. And I've talked to other communists about this very point. They said you never leafleted on a busy street at a high traffic hour, shoving pro-Castro literature, into somebody's face. What you did is you waited till nighttime so you wouldn't embarrass people in public, and you shoved it under their doors. Okay, so why did Oswald do what he did? Because that's what he was supposed to do. The aim was to blow up the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which, by the way, happened right after the assassination. Okay, I'm done.
John, you have 3 minutes then?
Sure. He didn't have any real communist associates because he really was a loner. He had neither the inclination nor the social skills nor the social capital to be part of any communist movement. He was engaged in an enterprise of self-aggrandizement. As Jim said, yes, he did write figures in the CPUSA. When he sent a couple of bigwigs, I think it was Gus Hall and somebody else, a Fair Play for Cuba Committee membership cards. Remember, he had a rump chapter, not officially approved by any means of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He got a response back from a guy named Aaron Johnson? I'm not sure. The guy named Johnson. And he was elated by that. He told Marina, Marina asked him, has one person come to you as a result of them, the leaflets? People don't care about them here. And Oswald replied, see this? And he shook the letter in her face and said, these are people who understand me and think I'm doing useful work. If he respects what I'm doing, then it's important. He's the Lenin of our country. Oswald was extraordinarily naive about politics. He actually took the CPUSA seriously, and the CPUSA was by now 2.5 decades past its peak of power in the 1930s. It was typically characterized as little ladies in the Bronx in tennis shoes. Now, it's interesting that some communists in Texas would say Oswald was CIA.
I don't know.
I mean, how would a communist in Texas know that? I don't know. I think people are just blowing off and don't actually know anything. But what you had there is a whole. I'm not sure I remember all of Jim's points here, but it was a big lying about. He certainly lied about his activities. When he was arrested in New Orleans, he demanded that he talked to an FBI agent. A fellow named Quigley came down to talk to him, and Oswald claimed to be part of a Fair Play for Cuba Committee chapter in New Orleans. Well, Quigley quizzed him on that, and Oswald said he couldn't name any of the members. He said he'd been to a meeting. He remembered just the first names, not the last names of the members. He was asked how the meeting was called, and he said he had got a telephone call, but then he said he didn't have a telephone. At any rate, what he told Quigley was complete nonsense. So he was basically a politically incompetent and naive person engaged in an enterprise of self-aggrandizement.
15 seconds.
That's all.
Okay, Jim, you have your 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, okay, again, this is funny. A self-deluded person who just happened to stamp 544 Camp Street on the Corliss Lamont figures, okay? Also, if you read John Newman's book, the FBI scratched out that address of their reports that went ahead and went up to Washington, all right? Now, how do we know about this Stanford guy in Texas? Because the FBI tracked him down. The FBI tracked this guy down because they were getting all these reports in the papers at that time about Oswald really wasn't a communist. Oswald was really some kind of undercover intelligence operative. So finally, this is Cartha DeLoach, okay, actually tracked this lead all the way down, past Lonnie Hudkins, past everybody else, and he finally found out that it originated with this guy in San Antonio who told Yarborough, the senator, that that Stanford said that he was a CIA agent. Now, it didn't go any further than that, of course, because they didn't want to know any of the details about it. You won't find that guy's name in the Warren report, by the way. Okay, and that report, by the way, the Deloach investigation, was not declassified until 1977. Why do we have to wait all 14 years to find out that fact? Why is there nothing in the Warren report about the FBI and CIA attempts to infiltrate the Fair Play for Cuba Committee? Why do we have to wait 30 years to find out that David Phillips was a guy in charge of that whole enterprise along with James McCord out of CIA headquarters? Why did we have to do that? And the obvious answer to everybody except him, okay, is that the Warren Commission didn't want us to know that Oswald really had all these ties to U.S. intelligence. When Quigley went to see him
15 seconds.
in New Orleans, the guy working at FBI headquarters found his name as an informant under Warren Debris' name. I'm done.
Okay, John, you have 2 minutes to reply.
Okay, I'm not sure who he means finding his name as an informant, if that's Wilcott or that's somebody else. The whole notion that he was an informant was essentially sort of made up. There are different stories about that. Hugh Ainsworth basically says that Lonnie Hudgens, a rather lazy reporter, called him up one night soon after the assassination and said, give me something. I need to write a story. And Ainsworth looked at his desk calendar and got a number off of the desk calendar and said Oswald was an FBI informant, and that was his number, which is different, by the way, from being a CIA informant. As for why we have to wait, there's lots of stuff classified that has now been declassified, and it's certainly obvious that there's nothing sinister in it. Government bureaucracies just don't declassify stuff quickly, partly because they're risk-averse, and they worry that they might declassify something that they really shouldn't, for example, confidential information about an informant. But, for example, when a lot of documents were declassified in the 1990s, a lot of them were simply news clippings. They were stories from the popular press that everybody had known about for a long time. As for 544 Camp, 544 Camp was a block and a half from where Oswald worked at the Riley Coffee Company. If he had just walked around the neighborhood, particularly walked down to Lafayette Square, he would have seen the building. At one point, there would have been a for rent sign in the building. Given that he wrote the Fair Play for Cuba Committee that he had an office, he was clearly thinking about an office, although there's no evidence at all that he ever had an office there. But he was clearly thinking about it. And it's interesting that he wrote the Fair Play for Cuba Committee about an affray, a confrontation with anti-Castro forces. He was clearly thinking about that. Indeed, apparently, in his little demonstration, his handing out leaflets on Canal Street, that probably was intended
15
as a provocation. That is to say, he wanted to provoke a reaction because he liked being in the news. He liked being a spokesperson for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Okay, we'll leave that. We'll go to the next question, which is for you, John, and it's, did Oswald order the rifle in evidence?
Sure, he ordered it from Klein Sporting Goods. He filled out a coupon in the American Rifleman and sent it to Klein Sporting Goods. It was in an envelope, and there was a money order with it. The coupon, the return address of the envelope, and the money order all were available after the assassination. The envelope and the coupon on microfilm, the money order in its original form, all three have Oswald's handwriting on them. It was C2766. That was the serial number on the rifle. It was shipped to a post office box. Let's be specific. It was shipped to A. Heidel, with Heidel being a very well-known alias of Lee Harvey Oswald, Post Office Box 2915, Dallas, Texas. Oswald's name and handwriting were on the application for the box, and so that handwriting evidence makes it pretty clear. Yeah, he ordered the rifle. Now, conspiracists will nitpick this way, the 15 ways from Sunday. For example, nobody can prove that it was Oswald rather than somebody else who picked up the rifle. So if you want to just posit, if you just want to make something up and posit that somebody else picked the rifle up, you can, except that person would have needed to be a Confederate of Oswald's to know that there was a rifle there and that he was supposed to go pick it up. He would have had to have the key to the box. If you want to posit a Confederate, feel free, but somebody certainly picked up the rifle, finding a slip in the box that Oswald rented, and then taking it to the window and getting the rifle. He ordered the rifle. And again, what we have is hard evidence, handwriting evidence, and I'm sure Jim can nitpick the evidence trail 15 ways from Sunday, but he can't make Oswald's handwriting go away. I'm done.
Okay, Jim, you have 3 minutes to reply to that then.
Okay, this is what I warned him about 2 weeks ago, his reliance on this handwriting evidence, which I said does not match up at the Hotel de Comercio. Now, stay with me as I go through all these things you have to believe for that handwriting evidence to take precedence over everything else. On that day, March 12, 1963, Oswald was supposed to have been gone for over an hour when he mailed this coupon. If you look at the JCS work records, there's no time allotted for that absence at all, and they're in the Warren Commission. He then walked 11 blocks to the local post office that morning, in one postal zone. But guess what? He doesn't mail it from the post office. Think about that. You're at the post office, but you don't mail the letter. He walked 4 miles out of his path to mail it in a mailbox in postal zone 12, which is about as far away from that post office as you can get. It's beyond the Trinity River. Why would you do that? This would extend his time that he's absent from work to at least 90 minutes. Okay? That coupon and money order was made out in A. Heidel's name. It arrived in Chicago over 700 miles away, and it was deposited within 24 hours. This is way before the advent of computers. All right? But it wasn't passed through the Federal Reserve System because the money order does not maintain all the stamps necessary to reveal that fact. Now, he talks about this money order. This is what he leaves out. If you go ahead and look at the money orders that were filed from that post office in that year, and if you match up how many were sold per month, that money order is out of sequence by at least a year. In other words, that's a different number than what should have been sold that particular month. The bank deposit slip, the extra copy provided by the bank at the time of deposit, reads February the 15th, which is wrong. It's supposed to read March the 13th. All right? And the commission never could find the exact deposit where that money order was supposed to be deposited. Okay? In other words, it couldn't find a batch of deposits on the particular day that that money order was supposed to be included in. Now, to me, the capper in this is they send him the wrong rifle. The order was for a 36-inch carbine. The rifle in evidence is a 40-inch short rifle. Okay? Gary Mack, who Mr. McADAMS calls the dean of researchers, explains it like this. Well, they ran out of 36-inch rifles. Okay, so if I order a pair of shoes from a company I order with from Maryland, they're out of those pair of shoes. They send me another one, right, that I never ordered. Okay, happens every day. Well, in their world, I guess it does. All right? Now, he talks about the post office box. The order was in Heidel's name. So when Oswald went to pick up this rifle, he would have had to presented proof, number one, that it was his post office box, and number two, that he was Heidel. In other words, he would have had to presented that he had an alias. This would have gone up the line. You don't do that with just a guy right there. Somebody would have remembered that event. And don't tell me that they wouldn't. Okay? Nobody did.
That's your time. That's the three. John,
okay.
John, you have 2 minutes to reply.
Yeah. I mean, as for the wrong rifle business, look, we're talking about a $12 worth surplus weapon. Clients probably knew that they could get away with substituting a slightly different rifle. I'm not sure what this proves. I mean, is there a conspiracy rifle that's 38 inches long and a lone assassin rifle that's 40, or I'm sorry, the other way around, and they somehow mistakenly shipped him the conspiracy rifle, giving the whole thing away rather than the lone assassin rifle, which he was supposed to get? That simply has no significance at all. As for no absence on his time clock at Jagger Style Soval, probably people slip out of work all the time, and then they come back and they don't bother to check out. I frankly don't know what to make of all this beyond the Trinity River and money are out of sequence business, but I've run across so many factoids like that before. I don't take it very seriously. The simple fact is that on the money order was Lee Harvey Oswald's handwriting. The Warren Commission and then later the House Select Committee examined the original money order with Oswald's handwriting. As for having to present proof, Harry Holmes told the Warren Commission that pretty much the employees at the counter assumed that if you had the slip that was put in the box, that you had legitimate access to the box, and you'd present the slip, and they would get you the merchandise, so whatever it is. I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, we're talking about postal employees. I don't think they're in the mood to hassle people 15 ways from Sunday, and it is reasonable to assume that if you I mean, Harry Holmes said, hey, suppose my brother comes and visits me, can he get mail?
15 seconds.
That sounds perfectly sensible. I'm done.
Okay, Jim, you have 2 minutes to reply.
Well, I'm just flabbergasted. I mean, he says there's nothing unusual about not mailing a coupon at a post office, okay? And you're supposedly on an unchecked break from work, but you go ahead, you don't mail at the post office, you go ahead and you walk like 5, 6, 7 miles beyond to drop it in a mailbox. Okay, I have never done anything like that in my life, and I've never met anybody who did. And if they ever told me they would do that, I would say you need a shrink. But to him, he doesn't bat an eyelash. To him, that's not unusual at all. And I can't believe he just sloughs off the differences. It wasn't just a difference in the measurement of the rifle. It was a difference in the whole type of rifle. I mean, you studied the Mannlicher Carcano. This is a totally different kind of a rifle. It's classified as a carbine, okay? So it's not like it was just a difference of 36 and 40s, but also they said that the House Select Committee interviewed those guys. They said that they did not put scopes on that particular kind of rifle, all right? And there's a strong evidence that at that time that Kleins did not have that 40-inch rifle. And this is why he says all the microfilm was there. The FBI got the microfilm November the 23rd. They took it away from Kleins. They did not make it public again until the end of May. Okay? So for 6 months, they had this stuff all by themselves. And I would like to hear him explain how Ruth Pein marked the date, March the 20th, on her calendar, which she had prepared for the Warren Commission, when nobody knew at that time that was a date that Oswald allegedly received the rifle. Okay?
15 seconds.
All right, I'm done.
Okay, the next question is for you then, Jim. Also, we're alternating. In your opinion, are the backyard photos genuine?
Well, I don't think they are. Okay, in addition to various technical analysis, I have at least 3 other objections. Okay, the Imperial Reflex camera was not found among Oswald's possessions during the search of the Pein household on Friday or Saturday. The police found 3 cameras. One was an American stereo realist. The second one was a Russian Quera, and then there was the miniature camera, the Minax. Here's the problem. None of those cameras could produce the backyard photos, because those are made up on 620 roll film. The other 3 cameras took the equivalent of 35 millimeter shots. Now, 2 weeks after Kennedy's assassination, what happens? The ever-present Ruth Pein gives the Imperial Reflex not to the Dallas police, not to the FBI, not to her buddy Bardwell Odom, but to Robert Oswald. Why? I think because they wanted Marina to go along with the story that Oswald bought the Imperial Reflex in America and then left it with his brother Robert while he was in Russia. To do this, the first American camera, the serial-realist camera, had to disappear, which, by the way, happened. After Marina says Oswald's real camera, after they get her go along with the story about the imperial reflex, Ruth Pein suddenly steps forward and says, "Oh no, the serial-realist, that was my camera," which she didn't realize until, get this, August of 1964. She realized the FBI had her camera 9 months later. All right, this good Quaker woman. Okay, now why wasn't all that investigated? Why was Ruth Pein not questioned thoroughly about all this stuff? Why did the FBI not track down her story? Okay, furthering the idea that this story is a cover story, when the House Select Committee tested Marina over the knowledge of how to use the imperial reflex camera, she didn't know how to use it. She said that you raise it to eye level. Wrong. On that particular camera, you keep it at your waist, you look down at the viewfinder. Okay, so the most important pictures you ever took, she didn't know how to take. The third thing I object to is the de Mohrenschildt photograph. When this photograph surfaced, something like 13 years after the fact, convenient with all this writing on the back, which I know, Mr. McAdams is going to say, "Oh, God, well, that cinches the case." All right, okay. This thing shocked the investigators, the House Select Committee. First of all, it has a slightly wider field of view than the other pictures. Second, it has a different border on it. Third, it has a remarkably higher resolution. Okay, you can read the newspaper printing in that picture. You can't in the other ones. Even the House Select Committee said that photo had to have been made on an expensive enlarger, usually found at some kind of photographic store. Now, McAdams is going to say the House Select Committee said they were genuine. What he doesn't say is that they admitted there was a line across Oswald's chin that extended out to the neck area. How did they explain this?
15 seconds.
Okay, if you're sitting down, they said it was a water spot. Since when do water spots make perfectly straight lines? I'm done.
John, you have...
I don't know why the huffing and puffing about the imperial reflex. The House Select Committee on Assassinations not only had the 3 backyard photos, they had a bunch of photos, casual family snapshots, shot apparently by Lee Oswald in the months before the assassination, and those match the imperial reflex too. Oswald clearly had the imperial reflex. So how do you match a camera? How do you match prints to a particular camera? 2 things. One is the film plane aperture. If you have the negative, or if you have a print that is not cropped and shows the very edge of the image area, what you see is slight imperfections in the film plane, typical on cheap cameras. That is equivalent to a fingerprint. And the fingerprint, or the aperture marks on the backyard photos, are identical to test shots made with the imperial reflex and identical to casual family snapshots found among Oswald's possessions. You can also match things by scratches on the film. There's 133B, actually, there's a negative of that, so you can look at the scratches on the negative. 133A has such high resolution, you can also look at the scratch pattern because it shows in the print, and the scratch pattern, again, that's like a fingerprint on the negative on 133B, and the print of 133, at least the de Mohrenschildt print of 133A, match the imperial reflex. Now, 133A has on the back of it, in Oswald's handwriting, something to the effect, I don't remember exactly, to my good friend George de Mohrenschildt, signed Lee Oswald. As for the wide field of view and the high resolution, that's simple. Oswald worked at Jaggers Child Stovall. He even asked a fellow employee what Jaggers Child Stovall thought about employees using their equipment for their own personal use. The employee said, well, hey, that's okay if it doesn't get out of hand. Yes, they would have had a very high-quality enlarger. Apparently, he used a 4x5 film carrier to print his 2¼ by 2¼ negative. That's why the film plane aperture is visible on the print. That's why the wide field of view. As for the line across the chin, no, there was no line. They didn't admit there was a line across the chin. Actually, look at the report, House Select Committee on Assassination 6. There was a watermark, but they blew up the chin area. They digitized and enhanced the grain pattern, and there's no discontinuity
15 seconds.
in the grain pattern. What happens is there's a slight darkening because it was in the shade. There is no real line. People got the idea there was a line because people looked at fourth or fifth generation prints, and you copy a print, you increase the contrast. So eventually that slightly darkened area became a line. That's not the way it is in first-generation prints. That's not the way it is in the negative of 133B. If I have some more time, we can talk about other things the House Select Committee did, like, for example, approving the shadows.
That was your 2 minutes. Jim can reply, and you'll have 2 minutes back. Jim, your 2 minutes now.
Okay, again, I can't believe he doesn't bat an eyelash about the Dallas police going for 2 searches and not finding the camera. To him, I guess that happens every day, and it took her 2.5 weeks to find the camera. Okay, fine. All right, now, here's a question about this, by the way, and it's completely, I don't know where he got that stuff about them not saying there's a line there. They do say that there's a line there, and then they even had to explain why the 2 chins are different. Okay? Oswald had a slightly rounded chin. The guy in that photograph has almost a straight cleft chin. So when one of the House Select Committee, so when he says the House Select Committee dismissed this, that's complete bogus. All right, Floyd Fithian, one of the members of that committee, brought up that point. How come they have 2 different chins? Where did this other guy's chin come from? So what does McMamie do, the photographic expert that Blakey hired? He tries to take pictures from Oswald's youth to try and say, well, see, the chin is a little bit straighter here. So now what that would have to do, pictures taken like 11 years ago with these supposed pictures, escapes me. And by the way, it escapes Floyd Fithian too, because he said, wait a minute, none of those pictures you're showing me even approximate this chin that you have in these supposed backyard photographs. And then, of course, what he says about the shadows, Mike Griffith took those photographs to 5 professional photographers. And he said, will you explain to me these differing shadows and the way they're cast, why they're shorter and so on? And they all said, look, you take a picture like that with those kind of shadows, it simply betrays that you have 2 light sources. Okay, there's almost no other way to explain it, which, of course, could not have been there, for all the reasons that we know. All right, they were taken in the backyard. All right, and you could use the imperial reflex as a copy camera. Bob Groden proves that in his book. The other way you could have done it, you could have just inserted the other film into the film plate, okay, to get those, oh my God, fingerprints, mark of fingerprints, they have to be genuine. Okay, so in his world, stuff like that never happens. I'm done.
John, you have 2 minutes then to reply.
Yeah, Mike Griffiths is one of those people who specializes in finding so-called experts who are in fact clueless and getting them to say what he wants. You determine that the shadows are consistent with something called vanishing point analysis. I won't explain that, but it's in something that apparently conspiracists haven't actually read, which is the Photographic Evidence Panel's report in House Select Committee on Assassinations, Volume 6. And there was a water spot line, but it was not the famous line across the chin. Again, they looked at the chin, they magnified it, they scanned it, they enhanced it to bring out the grain pattern, and they came up with no inconsistencies. As for using the imperial reflex as a copy camera, the House Select Committee on Assassinations actually tried doing that to see if you could make a convincing copy. And again, why conspiracists never read that, I don't know. What they found was 2 things. If you tried doing that, number one, you would have a severe, and you can see the pictures in the House Select Committee volumes, you would have a severe drop-off in illumination at the corners of the picture. It looked very, very different. And number 2, a large increase in barrel distortion. That is to say, a distortion of straight lines around the edges of the picture. So you can just, compare. You can look at what they did, trying to copy photographs with the imperial reflex, and it's just flat out not a convincing copy. It's very poor quality because the optics in that camera are very poor quality. And again, Oswald signed the photo that he gave to George de Mohrenschildt. And why he would sign a phony photo is an interesting question.
15 seconds.
Marina and Marguerite both admitted to burning, on the night of the assassination, burning photos of Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle. They're admitting that the photos existed at that time, and neither have ever said that, gosh, we found these photos and, hey, we didn't know where they came from. They look phony. They never said that.
Okay.
Because, of course, Marina knew she took them.
Right, that's the time for that question. All right, we'll move on. John, it's for you then. Number 8, did the House Select Committee cover up evidence of a large exit wound in the back of JFK's head?
No. What they did was they looked at the best evidence. Remember, some evidence is better than other evidence. Very poor evidence is eyewitness evidence. Very good evidence is photographs and X-rays. And they authenticated the photos, and they authenticated the X-rays up the wazoo. As I talked about last time, they looked at the dentition in the X-rays. It matched pre-mortem X-rays of John Kennedy. They looked at the sinus cavities in the autopsy X-rays. They matched pre-mortem sinus cavities of John Kennedy. They looked at stereo pairs. Now, I don't know if probably some of your listeners had a Viewmaster as a kid, which is basically a stereoscope. If you take two pictures of something and you move the camera, just a little bit between the two pictures, and you look at one of them with the left eye and one of them with the right eye, you can see it in stereoscopic viewing. The significance of stereo pairs is that it's essentially impossible to fake a stereo pair. By the way, backyard photos 133A and 133B constitute a stereo pair, and they view them as stereo pairs. So no evidence whatsoever of any kind of fakery. They had forensic anthropologists examine the face, ears, and visible features of Kennedy, comparing, and remember, forensic anthropologists don't just ask, well, hey, does it look like the same guy? That's Weberman and Canfield nonsense, just asking, does it look at the same guy? They look at metric and morphological characteristics that can be classified and measured. And yes, the guy in those autopsy photos is John Kennedy. There's simply no doubt about it. The forensic pathology panel looked at the photos and X-rays. They talked to the doctors. They looked at all the evidence, but of course the best evidence is the photos and X-rays. And they said Kennedy was hit by two shots from behind, one in the back at C7T1, one in the cowlick area of the head, and indeed there's a stereo pair of camera original color transparencies of the entrance defect, blowing out the right top of his head, blowing out parietal bone, roughly from the cowlick area to the coronal suture. There's some argument about whether it was beyond the coronal suture or just the coronal suture, but generally that area. And we're talking about the top forensic pathologist in the country.
15 seconds.
So I don't know if Jim has someone like Mike Griffith to dispute that.
Jim, you have 3 minutes.
I have the HSCA themselves to dispute that. He talks about this photographic certification. Well, it turns out that, like a lot of things in the House Select Committee, that was a cover story. Gary Aguilar found the documents that were hidden from us for only about 20 years, but I'm sure he'll find an excuse for why it was hidden, that they never really did have the camera. Okay, that they understood that they didn't really have the camera, so they basically just papered that over. They never really could find a camera, from the Pentagon. So the certification was basically not accurate. He will never admit that. Shocking what he says about the pre-mortem and post-mortem X-rays of JFK, because Dave Mantik actually put these on the board once at one of these conferences. He showed the pre-mortem, showed the post-mortem X-rays. It's shocking to look at. I mean, it really is. If you've never seen Mantik's presentation on this, when I saw this, I kind of leaned forward. I go, wow. Because they don't have anywhere near the pattern that the pre-mortem X-rays have. All right? Now, let's talk a little bit about the House Select Committee's cover-up of this issue, because Mr. McAdams was part of this cover-up. When Gary Aguilar used to argue that the Dallas witnesses saw this blowout in the back of the head, Mr. McAdams used to read back this is how confident he was, the House Select Committee report on this issue, saying that the Dallas witnesses were wrong since the Bethesda witnesses did not see this. Okay, so somehow they were wrong. He always leaves out the fact that a picture and can only be represented by the person who takes it, and he has to vouch for that's the picture he took. You'd have a lot of problems with that, believe me. Well, we know today that the House Select Committee was lying about this, and it was designed to keep the lid on the cover-up, which he was also eager to go jump on board with. Okay, and that the aim was not to admit that they were actually right, because you have these Bethesda witnesses who said the same thing. What's the proof of that? Today, nobody will take the responsibility for writing that part. Blakey won't take it, Andy Purdy won't take it, Michael Bodden won't take it, but somebody has to be lying. Gary Aguilar thinks it's Purdy. I actually think it's Bodden because of his history of doing this kind of stuff. But have you ever seen Gary's evidence on this? He's got like 40 witnesses going all the way from Kemp Clark and McClellan in Dallas down to Mr. Robertson at the funeral parlor, who all say that they saw this wound, in the back of JFK's head. Okay, now he's going to argue that it's really parietal. What the reports actually say, it's occipital and parietal. What that means is it's in the back right side of the head. So if you buy his story, what you've got is two blowouts on the parietal area of JFK's side of the head, which makes absolutely no sense at all. I kind of think that it was probably Bodden who put this cover-up together because he's falsified evidence before. He told Ida Dox to draw a revised cowlick wound to make the revised wound look more like a wound instead of a blood spot. But there's no doubt there was a cover-up about that.
Okay, John, you have 2 minutes to reply.
I hope everybody who's listening is just keeping count of the number of people that would have to be involved in the conspiracy, because everywhere we turn to looking at the hard evidence, it's cover-up, line. As for Aguilar's nonsense about the camera, when Bethesda finally produced a camera for the House Select Committee on Assassination, they had no way of knowing whether it was actually the same camera body or not. With sheet film cameras, you can't know. It certainly did not have the same lens on it. That doesn't change the fact that the photos were authentic. Whatever camera they used took stereo pairs of John Kennedy that showed no evidence of compositing, no evidence of faking. As for the X-rays not matching, he quotes Mantic. That's bizarre. You've got Mantic against the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Mantic is the guy who claims the Zapruder film was faked. Mantic is a radiation oncologist, not an expert on photographic evidence, and not strictly speaking an expert on reading X-rays, because radiation oncologists basically attack cancer tumors by directing radiation at them, and that's the whole thing is rather bizarre. Now, as for Aguilar's witnesses. Number one, witnesses really aren't as good as photographs, but Aguilar quite simply misrepresents his witnesses, and I have a list of witnesses he clearly misrepresented on my website, which you can go to. Simple thing is jfkassassination.net/head HEAD.htm. For example, he calls Nurse Doris Nelson a back-of-the-head witness, and Life magazine had her show on her head where the defect was. She puts it right at the top in parietal bone. He lists Clint Hill, who did say the wound was, quote, in the back of the head. Then for National Geographic in the early 90s, well, maybe it was the early 2000s, Clint Hill said back of the head, but then he said a wound about the size of my palm above the ear. He put Stringer on there, who authenticated, it's on his list of people who believed a back of the head blowout, and Stringer authenticated in 67 the autopsy photos and X-rays as they now exist. He puts Gerald Custer, who drew the wound. I think he's the one who drew the wound for the ARB. Okay, go ahead. Okay, right. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. You have 2 minutes, Jim, to reply.
If you take a look in 279 of the assassinations, this is what the HSCA comment. This is the comment, that the ARB wrote. Because the Department of Defense was unable to locate the camera and lens that were used to take these autopsy photographs. That's what it says. Now, there might be an out from there someplace, but, it's true. Maybe they did, at that particular day, that lens was on that camera. But it's never, ever been certified. And you can't make a comparison if you're not sure that you have the same equipment that you had when you originally took it. By the way, His thing about the House Select Committee over Mantic. Mantic has testified in court. In other words, he's been certified by a judge to be able to testify about the authenticity of X-rays, and he's actually done it. In that particular case, he said that the X-rays, were genuine. To take somebody like off the House Select Committee and say that they have more dignity, more reliability than Dave Mantic is ridiculous, because this is the same committee that when James Humes would not agree to raise the back wound, the entrance wound in the back, to the top of the skull, Petty, one of the doctors, took him outside in the hallway and started berating him and yelling at him to get him to change his story. These are the kind of people, that McADAMS backs without telling you the dirty things that they do when nobody's looking. Okay, I'll take Dave Mantic any day over any of those guys, including Bodden, because Bodden's the guy who said that the FBI took the photographs at Bethesda that night when their two FBI agents said we didn't take one picture all night. He said that story in front of 1,200 people at the Duquesne conference. Gary Aguilar told him he was wrong. Guess what? He repeated it on cable television. So this is a guy who doesn't care what he says. All right? But Mr. McADAMS says that's fine. As long as he says what I'm saying, I'm gonna back this guy. He actually drew fractures. He told Ida Docs to draw fractures on diagrams that don't actually exist in the X-rays. How can you possibly back a guy like this? If we had anybody like that, Mr. McADAMS would be spitting on him. He'd be discrediting him all over his website. Somehow, Michael Bodden is sacred to him. Okay?
That's your time
the
now.
The guy who basically made a life out of this. Okay.
Okay, Jim, the next question is for you, though, and it's question 9. Was President Kennedy's intent to withdraw from Vietnam at the time of the assassination?
Oh, well, okay, that's a no-brainer. Yeah, undeniably, yes. And the really nice thing about this is that the academic world is now coming around to it, okay? First it was John Newman, then it was Howard Jones, then David Kaiser, then Robert Dallek, and now James Blight of Brown University. Blight held a 2-day academic conference a couple years ago in which at the end of the 48 hours of exploration of the record, the newly declassified record, 50% of the attendees said that it was true he was going to withdraw at the time of his death. The ARB has now declassified too much evidence in this regard. The May 1963 SEPT conference in Hawaii, with McNamara supervising withdrawal and actually telling them that we're doing it too slow, we have to speed it up. Army Chief of Staff Wheeler saying that any opposite reply to the decision to withdraw would be met with a negative response. The audio tape of McNamara telling Mac Bundy they need to find a way to get out of Vietnam. And finally, there's the cream on the cake is Bundy's posthumous memoir written through Gordon Goldstein, in which now you have Bundy saying that Kennedy was going to withdraw and nothing was going to change his mind. So now you have Max Taylor, McNamara, and Bundy, the 3 chief military advisors, now all saying that Kennedy was going to withdraw. But it's even better than that, because in the book that Blight co-wrote, Virtual JFK, it's now revealed that Lyndon Johnson himself understood that Kennedy was going to withdraw, and not only did he consciously reverse that policy within 48 hours, at his first meeting on the subject, he made the agenda clear that we're going to win in Vietnam. He's now trying to get McNamara to take back the withdrawal plans that he knew McNamara had announced. Okay? That's how deep into this that Johnson is. He wants McNamara to change his story so it doesn't look like it's his responsibility. Okay, so unless you're somebody like Noam Chomsky, which I don't think Mr. McADAMS likes, okay, then this debate is over. And again, why did we have to wait until the ARB to get all this documentation, and even beyond the ARB? Why do we have to wait over 30 years? There's been tons of stuff that's not even in John Newman's trailblazing book that we have now that basically go ahead and put the cap on this. It's essentially all over. All right, I'm done.
Okay, Kennedy wanted to withdraw by the end of 1965 under the assumption that the South Vietnamese could be trained to take over the fighting themselves. That's what the McNamara-Taylor report said it looked forward to that being a possibility. Nobody can really know, but Kennedy, I mean, let's look at Kennedy's statements right before he was assassinated. He, for example, in an interview with Walter Cronkite, he said, in the final analysis, it is the people in the government of South Vietnam who have to win or lose this struggle. All we can do is help, and we are making it very clear. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That would be a great mistake. I know people don't like Americans to be engaged in this kind of effort. 47 Americans have been killed in combat with the enemy. But this is a very important struggle, even though they're far away. That's a couple of weeks before the assassination with Walter Cronkite. Then he talked to Huntley and Brinkley, and Huntley said, are we likely to reduce our aid to South Vietnam? Kennedy said, I don't think we think that it would be helpful at this time. If you reduce your aid, it is possible that you could have some effect upon the government structure there. Remember, they didn't like ZM for good reasons. That's my parenthetical comment. On the other hand, you have a situation that could bring about collapse. Brinkley, Mr. President, have you any reason to doubt this so-called domino theory that if South Vietnam falls, the rest of Southeast Asia will go with it? Kennedy, no, I believe it. I think that the struggle is close enough. China is so large, looms so high just beyond the frontiers, so that if South Vietnam went, it would not only give them an improved geographic position for a guerrilla assault on Malaya, but would also give the impression that the wave of the future in Southeast Asia it was China and communism. So I believe that it adds, what I am concerned about is that Americans will get impatient and say, because we don't like events in Southeast Asia, or they don't like the government in Saigon, that we should withdraw. That only makes it easy for the communists. I think we should stay. So that's a pretty clear statement. Now, Kennedy's supporters are basically reduced to saying, as Jim Douglas says, that he was lying. He was just flat out lying. But probably the best source on this, and I may need the rest of my 2 minutes later on this, is Bobby Kennedy. In April 30, 1964, Kennedy was interviewed by John Bartlow Martin of the John F. Kennedy Library. This was before the Vietnam War became grossly unpopular, so there was no particular reason for Bobby to make bogus claims that Kennedy was going to withdraw. And, of course, I guess as we all know, Bobby was very, very close to Kennedy.
15 seconds.
Okay, 15 seconds. Well, okay. Kennedy, just the loss of all Southeast Asia, and if you lost Vietnam, I think everybody was quite clear that the rest of Southeast Asia would fall. What if it did? Well, I think my 15 seconds is up. I'll read the rest of this interview in my 2 minutes.
All right, fine. I just wanted you to finish the sentence there. Okay, Jim, you have 2 minutes to reply.
Well, he surprised me. He does believe in Noam Chomsky. See, and this is how desperate these guys are. They don't care where they pick their information from. They'll go all the way to the left. They'll go all to the right. They'll go to the middle. They don't care where they're at on the map. Okay? This is exactly what Chomsky and Coburn do. They use JFK's public words to try and contradict what he's doing with these NSAMs, and in private. JFK could not, this is stupid. JFK could not tell we're getting out. And we're getting out fast because we know the regime there is totally corrupt and we can't support them. We've trained them all we can, okay? That's all we can do. I'm not sending combat troops there. Sure, right before the 1964 election, when he knows Nixon and Goldwater are going to eat his lunch every day over this issue. Everybody knows that when you start a war, people support it. Look at Iraq. Okay, now look at Iraq now. But to have been against Vietnam at that time, you'd have a really hellacious political battle here, and JFK was too smart for that. And so that's what he did. He said this mixed stuff. And John Newman, by the way, delineates this in his book, to the nth degree, showing that as he's saying this one thing, he's writing something else, and he's telling his closest advisors that we have to stay until the war. After the war, I can get out. I'll lose the election if I get out before. Okay, but come 1965, I'll get tarred and feathered in public, but we are going to go ahead and get out. All right, and JFK did not believe in the domino theory, and he did not believe it because of his visit to South Vietnam in the early 1950s. He was totally against the French, involvement in South Vietnam. 1957, he goes on the floor of the Senate, and he says, we cannot support French colonialism anymore, okay, in Vietnam or in Algeria. And Mac Bundy said that to Gordon Goldstein. He says there's no way in the world that John F. Kennedy believed in the domino theory, because Lyndon Johnson believed in that thing until his dying day, and that spelled his Waterloo. Okay? All right, I'm done.
Okay, John, you have 2 minutes then.
Sure. Okay, we have the explicit claim that Kennedy was lying, getting a lot of Americans killed just so that he could win an election. Beautiful. That's an odd thing to hear from people who are fans of Kennedy. Now, I don't get my information on this from Noam Chomsky. I get it from Bobby Kennedy, and I was quoting Bobby Kennedy when my time ran out last time, so let me do it again. Martin, let's see, what was the overwhelming reason? Just that the loss of all of Southeast Asia. If you lost Vietnam, I think everybody was quite clear that the rest of Southeast Asia would fall. Martin, what if it did? Just have Kennedy, Bobby, that is, just have profound effects as far as our position throughout the world and our position in a rather vital part of the world. Also, it would affect what would happen in India, of course, which in turn has an effect on the Middle East, just as it would have, everybody felt, a very adverse effect. It would have an effect in Indochina, 100 million population. All of these countries would be affected by the fall of Vietnam to communists, particularly as we had made such a fuss in the United States under both President Eisenhower and President Kennedy about the preservation of the integrity of Vietnam. Martin, there was never any consideration given to pulling out. Bobby, no. Martin, at the same time, no disposition to go all in. Bobby, no. And Bobby explains that he did not want, and John did not want, a ground war in Asia. That's true. They'd been warned against that. But in 1963, they didn't think sending in American troops were necessary. They thought American advisors training South Vietnamese troops would do the job. But let's go back here. Bobby doesn't even entirely rule out American ground troops. He says, Martin, this is Martin again, his questioner. It's generally true all over the world, whether it's in a shooting war or a different kind of war, but the president was convinced that we had to stay there. Bobby, yes. Martin, and couldn't lose it? Bobby, yes. Martin, and if the Vietnamese were about to lose it, would he propose to go in on land if he had to? Bobby,
15
well,
seconds.
we'd face that when it came to it. They hadn't come to it yet. It was simply push had not come to shove, and only in 1995, after Kennedy's death, did Johnson have to decide to either go all out, go in with ground troops, or accept defeat.
Okay, that's the time for that question. Now we're before the summation. We're coming to the last question, which the idea was that John would be able to ask a question of Jim and Jim of John. And I had not planned on, I had not really thought this through if there should be a rebuttal or not. So I just want to ask you both right now, do you think you should just ask one question and call it that, or should we have the 3-minute, 2-minute rebuttal? Any opinion?
I'm fine with either.
Jim, do you have a preference?
I think we should just go ahead and ask the question without the rebuttal.
Okay, so there'll be a question and then an answer, and then the other person will ask a question and answer, and we'll leave it at that, and then go on to a summation. So in that case, John, it's your turn first, then to ask a question, then of Jim, and I guess what your meaning is of all the research community,
Sure. Jim, have you ever counted how many people you think must be lying scum involved in the cover-up? That is to say, it's been quite clear you think a very large portion of the FBI is, a very large portion of the CIA is, that multiple of the Dallas cops are, that the whole House Select Committee on Assassination is, that the whole Warren Commission was. If I mentioned the Rockefeller Commission, we haven't talked about that. You doubtless would include them too. I'm sure you believe there's been a media cover-up. I mean, give me an estimate. How many people? First of all, how many people involved in an assassination conspiracy? And number two, how many people involved in a cover-up?
Okay, Jim, you have time, I guess any time to recall.
Well, I've never made any. You're the one who's making these claims. Okay, I have never specified how many people I thought were involved in the conspiracy and how many people I thought, ran along with the cover-up. Okay, all I do is present evidence. Okay, and then the listener makes up his mind. Is that genuine evidence or it is not? If it's not genuine evidence, like the Walker bullet changing its color, shape, and caliber, okay, then you have to question it. And who was in charge yet? The FBI. See, but I think this dodges the question. Henry Wade was exposed by Craig Watkins in 2006 and 2007 as being the master of frame-ups in the Dallas police force. They've gone through 20 cases that have now been reversed, more than any other city, almost more than any other state, in which Henry Wade sent people to jail who were innocent. Now, on another website Mr. McAdams has, he's all for capital punishment. God knows how many of those people would be dead who were innocent if Mr. McAdams had his way. With Mr. McAdams, anybody who's indicted, has to be guilty. Okay, well, Craig Watkins has reversed that, and he's not even halfway done yet. Now, if you're going to talk about J. Edgar Hoover, this is a ridiculous question. The number of people that J. Edgar Hoover, convicted or ramrodded or framed who ended up being, innocent. He even used a professional perjurer, a guy named Harvey Matizal, who confessed years later, I was an FBI agent and I made up stuff on the stand. Now, to go through all the cases that J. Edgar Hoover, was involved in, from the beginning, the Palmer raids, this guy ripped people out of their homes and then planted agent provocateurs in their houses in 1919. So please don't tell me J. Edgar Hoover is as pure as a driven snow. And everybody knows that you went along with Hoover or you got canned. There's been Harry Whitby told Anthony Summers, he goes, I'm ashamed what we did on the JFK case. I sent in reports, okay, they were rewritten. So I got the message that we're not supposed to investigate this case, and for the motive that I said earlier. The idea that the Warren Commission would not go along with Hoover is ridiculous because if they didn't go along with Hoover, they had nobody investigate the case because Warren did not want to have private investigators. In a bureaucracy, you either go along or you get out. And as I think it was Stringer told Jeremy Gunn, there are some people who rebel in a case like this. And Jeremy Gunn goes, yeah, I know there are. He goes, but they don't last long. And that's Stringer saying that. He understood it too. Okay, do I get to ask him my question now?
Right, that was about 3 minutes. So, right, go ahead.
Okay. Why, Mr. McAdams, did you clearly misrepresent Michael Kurtz in his book, Crime of the Century, not mentioning his observations of Oswald and Bannister in that book in 1982? This really puzzled me, okay, because I didn't remember it that way. So I had to go down to the Cerritos Library to look this up. He does mention it. It's on page 203. You also implied that Kurtz never said anything about these observations until after the publication of that book in 1982. In reality, he footnotes that reference to an essay he wrote for an academic journal 2 years before that book was published. In other words, the true facts are the direct opposite of what you said they were. Further, Kurtz includes that essay in Louisiana history in his bibliography to that book. So how could you possibly miss that? Now, do you just make this stuff up as you go along? You don't care if it's true or not?
My understanding is that he made a oblique reference to what he saw in the first edition, but he didn't actually name the people. It came up on the Internet News Group years ago, and somebody actually wrote Kurtz and asked him, and he came back with the reply that, he didn't think it was that significant, and you'll hear him say in the Frontline documentary from 1993 that, yes, he saw all three of them together, but he didn't think it was that significant. By all means, if you... what was the page number? Did he actually mention the names Oswald, Bannister, and Ferry together? Or did he just make an oblique reference?
Question?
Jim, did you have that page number?
Is he asking me a question? Does he want me to answer it?
Okay, just go ahead, quick.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's on page 203, and he says about seeing Oswald and Bannister. He says that he didn't think it was important, and anybody who reads that book will know why. Because Kurtz thinks Castro did it. He doesn't believe in a CIA conspiracy, so he didn't think it was all that important.
I just know that somebody wrote him, someone on the Internet News Group, about that, and he came back with an excuse of why. So he said Oswald and Bannister. He didn't mention Ferry.
Is he asking me another question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, no, in that particular passage he doesn't, but in his book, in the article, he did. Because I looked up the article. He did mention Ferry.
Sure. Well, I'll see if I can get a copy of 1E and look that up. But on the Internet News Group, I know he was being pounded for doing exactly that. Someone wrote him, and his reply was not, hey, go look at page 203 and you'll see it. His reply was, I didn't think it was important. That was his reply.
Right.
So I wasn't basing what I said on reading first edition of the book. I have the second edition sitting over on my shelf. I was basing it on what happened on an Internet News Group, including a reply that Kurtz wrote to a participant.
Okay. Well, that's an answer for the question and further topic. Now we come to the summation, and it's roughly 4 minutes, but I'm sure we can just be a little lenient between 4 and 5 minutes. But John, you have time for a summation.
Sure. Okay. On all these issues, there's pretty much always a killer piece of evidence, sometimes 2 or 3. That is a piece of evidence that's quite hard, that can be examined scientifically, that pretty much proves the case. To try to impeach the case, conspiracists have to come up with genuinely massive claims of conspiracy, both among people to fake the evidence and among people to lie about the authenticity of the evidence later. Where Mexico City is concerned, it's Oswald's signature on the register of the Hotel Comercio. It's Oswald's application for a visa to Cuba. By the way, one copy of that was given to the Cuban government, by the Cuban government to the Warren Commission, another to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. So if that's faked, we have Fidel Castro's government trading in bogus documents at the behest of the CIA. Further, we have Oswald's 2 different versions of Oswald's letter to the Soviet embassy, complaining about his treatment in the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. We have Sylvia Duran's name in Oswald's address book. That's very solid evidence. We have a fair amount of witness testimony too, including Sylvia Duran, including 3 guys at the Soviet embassy. But the hardest evidence is the handwriting evidence. As for Oswald shooting at Walker, we have that note in Oswald's handwriting in Russian, written to Marina, telling her what to do when he might somehow fail to return, might be captured, or might be killed. That's exceedingly hard evidence. If you're talking about Oswald and the rifle, we have postal coupon. We have a coupon from the American Rifleman. We have an envelope with the return address on it. We have a money order, all in Oswald's handwriting. We have an application for post office box, again in Oswald's handwriting. If you want to look at the ballistics evidence, we have 2 fragments found in the front seat of the limo, which match Oswald's rifle, serial number C2766, to the exclusion of all other weapons. We have the backyard photos that certainly tie Oswald at least to a Manica Carcano, and the House Select Committee said that particular Manica Carcano, because there's a ding on the forestock, they call it Mark A, and their judgment is it's random. That is to say, it's not the kind of thing you'd get from a normal pattern of wear, which might be consistent across different Carcanos, but one that identifies it is the same one discovered in the depository and sits to this day in the National Archives. Jim didn't bring up the claim that a Mauser was discovered in the Texas School Book Depository. Maybe he'd tell us whether he believes that or not. The killer piece of evidence on that is newsreel footage shot by Tom Allier showing the rifle being recovered. It's not merely a Mannlicher Carcano. Distinctive marks show it to be the same Mannlicher Carcano that was entered into evidence and sits to this day at the National Archives in College Park. And I could go on and on. Some evidence is hard evidence. Some evidence is a lot mushier. Eyewitness testimony being what it is, anomalies in documents, something that doesn't quite add up. And remember, for conspiracists, any anomaly in a document must mean conspiracy. Jim gave no explanation. He said Oswald wouldn't walk all those miles to a post office box, assuming he did, and Jim's not just misinterpreting something. Why would conspirators go to that mailbox rather than another one? And besides, they got Oswald's handwriting on that. Why didn't they just put it in the closest mailbox wherever Oswald was supplying his handwriting? So there's hard evidence and there's mushy evidence. To have any sensible view of this particular case, you go with the hard evidence. You also ask the question of scenario. Does a given piece of evidence imply a reasonable scenario or not? And last time Jim brought up a bag supposedly sent to Ruth Pein's house that did not have enough postage on it. There's another bag, an entirely different bag that Tony Summers describes. What kind of conspiracy is that mails Oswald a bag? By the way, to believe this, you have to believe he was a co-conspirator. That mails Oswald a bag, but doesn't put sufficient postage on it, or in Tony Summers' case, puts a completely wacky address on it. It just makes no sense. It doesn't fit any plausible scenario. So you would always want to ask the question: does this supposed piece of evidence actually fit a conspiracy scenario? I mean, 38-inch rifle versus 40-inch rifle? What the hell difference does that make? We know it was C-2766. We know it was shipped from Klein Sporting Goods to Oswald's post office box. It's just not the case that one of those links is a conspiracy link and the other's a lone assassin link, and somehow they shipped the wrong one that was the giveaway to a conspiracy.
Well, John. Oh, we lost John. John, are you there? Jim, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I did not cut him off. We lost the line. I'll call him back. But
how long was he on?
It was about 5 minutes. So I'm offering you a little over 5 minutes. Well, go ahead. You have time to make your summation.
Right. Look, he talks about hard evidence. The Walker bullet was switched. The bullet that was found at Parkland Hospital is not the same bullet O.P. Wright and Tomlinson saw. He's impervious to evidence, okay? The Hotel de Comercio. If you believe that, you have to believe Oswald didn't know how to write his name. He screwed up all three names. It'd be like me signing a register. Anthony DiEugenio is my middle name, and James is my last name. Best evidence on the Mauser. The rifle says made in Italy 6.5. So we're supposed to believe they didn't look at that, and they just somehow screwed up that it was not made in Italy and it was not 7.65. See, and inevitably, what these guys do, they want me to explain how the conspiracy worked. They demand that I explain every in and out of the way. Well, I'm sorry, the case was covered up for so many years. To have me, a private citizen, go ahead and solve every in and out of why this thing happened, why this thing, that's just ridiculous. It's in a court of law, it's a ridiculous statement. All you have to do is prove a reasonable doubt. You don't have to prove the way the crime actually happened. But consider some of the other things he said. He says McADAMS, McADAMS said Tippett was having death spasms when Helen Markham talked to him. Helen Markham said that she talked to Tippett for 20 minutes. Those are some long spasms. Secondly, the doctors who did Tippett's autopsy said the bullet severed the brainstem. Tippett was dead instantly. So where did those spasms come from? McADAMS says in 1979, an interview with Tony Summers, Dan Campbell did not identify Oswald as being at 544 Camp Street, the implication being that Dan later added to his testimony. Pure and simple, that's another misrepresentation like he did with Kurtz. Campbell did identify him in 1979. See for yourself, just turn to page 293 of Summers' book, Conspiracy. He identifies him. The last show, the end of the show, he tries to say Corey Collins added to his testimony later. Well, that's a good criticism if there's no extenuating circumstances. Here there is. What he left out is Corey Collins is black, living in, a right-wing Ku Klux Klan-infested area. I would have second thoughts about coming clean the first time I talked to Garrison if I knew these guys might blow up my car. Okay? So he leaves all that stuff out. I'd go on and on, about all these things that he said. But he has to because nobody wants to buy the story these guys are selling anymore. The single bullet theory, would you buy that if it was presented accurately? Do you believe Oswald was the only Marxist in America with nothing but right-wing friends? Who believes in autopsy that the wounds magically move up and down and where entrance points later become exits? Okay? And for all these gyrations he performs with the record, he never asks the obvious question. Why were the FBI and Warren Commission investigations so poor and so incomplete? Why did we have to wait all this time to find, for example, the Lopez report, especially when it's so incriminating of what the Warren report was? All right? Because, like another guy, George Bush Jr., Mr. McADAMS, David Von Pein, Gary Mack, Gus Russo do not live in the reality-based, fact-based community. All right? Okay, they sell these deceptions and these fantasies about the past, you know? And so Russo and Dale Myers say that I'm anti-government, I'm anti-USA. Nothing could be further from the truth. This used to be a good country. Okay, I know because I lived in it when it was a good country. It had a strong and growing middle class, which is now disappearing. Today, you know, both husband and wife have to work to keep a house they can't sell since it's not worth what they paid for it. These gyrations and confabulations blind the public about how bad the president is by fantasizing about the past. Okay? You know, and people who can't deal with the past can't face the future or deal with the present. And that's what's happened to this country. I hope this debate helps those who are listening understand that crucial and central point about the death of JFK and the subsequent killing off of a better era. Okay, because it was a better era. And to me, this case is not about lead bullet analysis. It's not about trajectory angles. It's not about CE 399. It's about government secrecy and lies. It's about the continual decline that's taken place in this country because of that. The question is, who benefited from that decline? It sure wasn't me and you. Okay? Mr. McADAMS' goal is to keep us thinking about all those gyrations in the record, simply because I don't think he really cares what's happened to this country. In fact, I think he actually likes what's happened to America. I don't. And if I can make you see that, namely what he represents and all he's trying to hide and its impact on America, then I've done my job. Because to me, that's everything. Good night.
Okay. Well, just before you leave, I did get John back. So listen, we went through almost 4 hours of debate. I think that any one of these questions we could spend an hour or two on. There are two sides to the story, and I think I've given you time to at least scratch the surface and for people listening to do further research. John, are you there?
I guess he's not.
John? Well, I'm sorry about that. We lost his line, so I will send him an email. But that's how I just wanted to end this politely, that although we have varying views, John did accept, and he stood up and answered questions, so that's one thing.
No, I totally give him credit, Len. Von Pein, Gary Mack, and Ritzes wouldn't show up. He did. So let's give him credit for that.
Right. All right, then. We'll end this debate, and who knows, there may be another one. But thanks, then, Jim.
Okay. Good night, Len.
And I'll talk to you, I guess, in 2 weeks.
All
and,
right.
You know, people listening in, if you had questions or comments, please email me. I'd like to know what you thought, if you wanted to hear anything like this again, or is it just back to research interviews? Otherwise, we'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Black Op Radio, broadcasting weekly from the Fiasco Brothers recording studio in Vancouver, Canada. You're listening to the Fiasco Brothers Radio Network.